The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but life kept getting in the way. Today, though, I was determined. The trail was one I'd never taken before, a narrow path that wound through dense woods and up into the hills. It was supposed to be a 6-mile loop, but I wasn't worried. I had my backpack with water, a few snacks, a flashlight, and a light jacket. I checked the weather, clear skies, no rain, perfect conditions. The first mile was easy. The trail was well marked, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The air smelled fresh, like pine and earth, and I felt good, strong. I kept a steady pace, my boots crunching on the gravel and dirt beneath me. The trees were tall, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into patches of gold on the ground. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. By the time I reached the 2nd-mile marker, the trail began to climb. The incline was gradual at first, but soon it grew steeper, and I could feel the burn in my legs. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath and take a sip of water. The forest was thicker here, the trees closer together, and the sunlight didn't reach the ground as easily. It felt cooler, almost damp, and the air was heavier. I shrugged off the slight unease I felt and kept going. The 3rd mile was harder. The trail narrowed and the underbrush grew denser. Branches reached out like fingers, brushing against my arms as I passed. The ground was uneven, riddled with roots and rocks that threatened to trip me if I wasn't careful. I had to watch my step, which meant I wasn't paying as much attention to the trail markers. I told myself it was fine. I had a map on my phone, and the trail was supposed to be straightforward. But the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The sounds of birds had faded, replaced by an eerie silence that made the back of my neck prickle. I checked my phone. No signal. That wasn't unusual out here, but it still made me uneasy. I pulled out the map I'd printed before leaving home and unfolded it. According to the map, I should have been nearing a fork in the trail. One path would take me back down to the parking lot, and the other would continue up into the hills. I kept walking, my eyes scanning the ground for the markers, but they were harder to find now, faded and overgrown. I had to stop several times to make sure I was still on the right path. The sun was sinking lower, and the shadows were growing longer. I picked up my pace, my heart beating a little faster. I didn't want to be caught out here after dark. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, and the forest felt different now. Darker, quieter. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back despite the coolness. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the isolation get to me. But the feeling of being watched was hard to shake. When I finally reached the fork, I almost missed it. The signpost was old and weathered, the letters barely legible. I had to squint to make out the arrows. One pointed to the left, back toward the parking lot. The other pointed straight ahead, deeper into the hills. I hesitated. The sun was almost gone, and the thought of continuing into the unknown made my stomach twist. But the idea of turning back felt like giving up. I had come this far. I wanted to finish the hike. I took the trail that led deeper into the hills. The climb was brutal. The trail was steep and rocky, and my legs were screaming by the time I reached the top. But the view was worth it. The hills stretched out before me, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. For a moment, I forgot my unease. I stood there, breathing hard, and let the beauty of it wash over me. Then I turned to look back the way I'd come. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was too far away to make out any details, but I could tell it was a person. They were just standing there, motionless, watching me. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was just another hiker, someone who had taken the same trail. But why weren't they moving? Why weren't they waving or calling out? I raised my hand in a tentative wave, but the figure didn't respond. They just stood there, silent and still. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the light began to fade. I felt a cold knot of fear tighten in my chest. I told myself to stay calm, to think rationally. Maybe they were lost. Maybe they needed help. But the way they were standing, so still and silent, sent a chill down my spine. I turned and started walking again, faster this time. The trail led downhill, and I practically jogged, my eyes fixed on the ground in front of me. I didn't want to look back. I didn't want to see if the figure was following me, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. My skin crawled, and every sound, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me jump. I kept telling myself it was just the forest, just the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The trail twisted and turned, and the forest grew darker with every step. I pulled out my flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting through the gloom. It helped, but not much. The shadows seemed to press in closer, and the beam of light only made the darkness beyond feel more oppressive. I kept walking, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. My legs were tired, but I didn't dare stop. I had to get out of here. Then I heard it, a sound behind me, not the wind, not the trees. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel. My heart pounded in my chest, and I forced myself not to look back. I walked faster, my boots slamming against the ground. The footsteps kept pace, steady and unhurried. I wanted to run, but I was afraid of tripping in the dark. The trail was too narrow, too uneven. Couldn't risk it. The footsteps grew louder. I broke into a run, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The beam of light jerked and swayed, illuminating the trail in brief, frantic bursts. I could hear the footsteps behind me, faster now, matching my pace. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs burned, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, and the forest was a blur of shadows and light. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away. Then I saw it, a break in the trees, the parking lot. I was almost there. I pushed myself harder, my lungs screaming for air. The footsteps were right behind me now, so close I could almost feel the breath on my neck. I burst out of the trees and into the open, my legs giving out as I stumbled to the ground. I scrambled to my feet and turned, shining the flashlight back at the trail. There was no one there. The forest was silent, the trail empty. I stood there, trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. I scanned the trees, the shadows, but there was no sign of anyone. No footsteps, no movement, just the quiet rustle of leaves in the wind. I felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. The fear was still there, coiled tight in my stomach. I didn't know what I had seen, what I had heard, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I turned and ran to my car, fumbling with the keys as I unlocked the door. I threw myself inside and locked the doors, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. I started the engine and drove, not caring about the speed limit or the winding road. I just needed to get away. It wasn't until I was back on the highway, the forest far behind me, that I allowed myself to breathe. My hands were still trembling, and my clothes were soaked with sweat, but I was safe. I didn't know what had happened out there, and I didn't want to know. All I knew was that I wasn't going back. Not ever. The rest of the drive home was a blur. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But the road was empty, and the night was quiet. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was exhausted. I went inside, locked the door, and collapsed on the couch. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every creak of the house made me jump. I kept seeing the figure in my mind, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. The next morning, I told myself it had just been my imagination. The isolation, the darkness, the exhaustion. It had all gotten to me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something had been out there. Something had followed me. And even though I was safe now, the memory of it stayed with me. A shadow I couldn't shake. I never went back to that trail. I didn't even like driving past the area. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about it, about the figure in the trees, and I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for the next hiker to come along. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but work kept getting in the way. Finally, I had a free day and I wasn't going to waste it. The trail was supposed to be easy, just a few miles through the woods, leading to a lookout point with a view of the valley below. I packed light, just a water bottle, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and a protein bar. I didn't think I'd need much more than that. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, and the trees were just starting to turn colors. It felt like the kind of day where nothing could go wrong. The trailhead was easy to find, marked by a wooden sign with the name of the trail carved into it. I parked my car, grabbed my stuff, and started walking. The first mile was peaceful. The woods were quiet except for the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt path and the occasional chirp of a bird. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and I felt myself relaxing as I walked. I hadn't realized how much I needed this, just to be alone, away from everything. But as I got deeper into the woods, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first. The trail seemed narrower than I remembered from the map, and the trees were thicker, their branches twisting together overhead like they were trying to block out the sun. The light that filtered through was dim and greenish, making everything look strange and unfamiliar. I checked my phone to make sure I was still on the right path, but there was no signal. I told myself it was fine. I had a map and the trail was clearly marked. I just had to keep going. The further I went, the more the woods seemed to close in around me. The air felt heavier, harder to breathe, and the silence was unnerving. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig under my boot. I tried to shake the feeling that something was wrong, but it was like a weight pressing down on my chest. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the quiet get to me. But the longer I walked, the harder it was to ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stopped to take a drink of water and check the map again. According to the trail markers, I should have been close to the lookout point by now, but there was no sign of it. The trees were so thick I couldn't even see the sky anymore, and the path was barely visible under the fallen leaves. I felt a pang of unease but pushed it down. I wasn't lost. Couldn't be. I had been following the trail the whole time. I kept walking, but the trail started to slope downward, which didn't make sense. The lookout point was supposed to be on higher ground. I stopped again, my heart starting to race. Maybe I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. I looked around, trying to find a marker or a sign, but there was nothing. Just trees and more trees, all looking the same. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I told myself to stay calm, to think logically. I had a map. I could retrace my steps. But when I turned around, the trail behind me looked different. The path I had just walked was gone, swallowed up by the underbrush. I stared at the spot where it should have been, my stomach twisting into knots. This wasn't possible. I had just come from there. I took a step forward, pushing through the bushes, but there was no sign of the trail. It was like it had never existed. Panic started to rise in my chest, but I forced myself to breathe. I couldn't lose it now. I had to stay focused. I looked at the map again, but it didn't make sense. The landmarks didn't match what I was seeing around me. The trees were too dense, the ground too uneven. I felt like I was in a completely different place than where I had started. I decided to keep moving, hoping I would find something familiar. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, endless and unchanging. The light was fading fast, and I knew I didn't have much time before it got dark. I picked up my pace, my boots slipping on the wet leaves. My heart was pounding now, and every sound made me jump. The silence was unbearable, but the thought of hearing something was even worse. Then I saw it, a break in the trees up ahead. I felt a surge of relief and started running toward it, my legs burning with the effort. But when I reached the clearing, my relief turned to dread. It wasn't the lookout point. It was just a small, empty space surrounded by trees. In the center was a pile of rocks, stacked into a crude cairn. I had never seen anything like it before. It looked man-made, but there was no reason for anyone to be out here. The woods were supposed to be empty. I walked closer to the cairn, my stomach churning. The rocks were wet and slick with moss, and they looked like they had been there for a long time. I reached out to touch one, but something stopped me, a feeling like a warning in the back of my mind. I pulled my hand back and stepped away, my heart racing. I didn't know why, but I knew I shouldn't touch it. I turned around, trying to figure out what to do next. The sun was almost gone now, and the woods were getting darker by the minute. I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to keep moving. I started walking again, my flashlight in hand, but the beam of light only made the shadows around me seem deeper. Every step felt like a gamble, like I was walking into the unknown. I don't know how long I walked. Felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. Time didn't seem to work the same way here. The woods were endless, and I was starting to think I would never find my way out. My legs were shaking, and my throat was dry. I stopped to take another drink of water, but the bottle was almost empty. I didn't know what I would do when it ran out. Then I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. It was the sound of running water. I felt a spark of hope and started walking toward it, my exhaustion forgotten. The sound got louder as I got closer, and soon I could see a small stream cutting through the trees. I dropped to my knees beside it, cupping the cold water in my hands and drinking deeply. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. But as I sat there, catching my breath, I realized something. The stream wasn't on the map. I didn't know where it was or where it led. I felt the panic creeping back in, but I forced myself to stay calm. At least I had water now. That was something. I decided to follow the stream, hoping it would lead me somewhere, anywhere. The ground was uneven and slippery, and I had to move slowly to keep from falling. The trees were thinner here, and I could see the sky again. The stars were starting to come out, but they didn't bring me any comfort. They just reminded me how far I was from anything familiar. I don't know how long I followed the stream. Felt like forever. My legs were numb, and my mind was foggy with exhaustion. I was starting to think I would never find my way out, that I would be stuck in these woods forever. But then I saw it. A light, faint but steady, through the trees. I felt a surge of hope and started running toward it, my legs screaming in protest. As I got closer, I realized it was a cabin. A small, wooden cabin with a light on in the window. I almost cried with relief. I stumbled up to the door and knocked, my hands shaking. There was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. I tried the door and it creaked open. The cabin was empty. There was a table with a lantern on it, casting a warm glow over the room. There was a bed in the corner, neatly made, and a small kitchen area with a sink and a stove. It looked like someone lived here, but there was no one around. I didn't care. I was just glad to be out of the woods. I sat down at the table, my legs giving out beneath me. I felt like I could finally breathe again. I didn't know where I was or how I had gotten here, but I was safe. That was all that mattered. I don't know how long I sat there, just staring at the lantern. My mind was blank, too tired to think. But eventually, I realized I couldn't stay here. I had to keep moving. I had to find my way back. I stood up, my legs still shaky, and looked around the cabin. There was a door on the other side of the room, and I walked over to it, hoping it would lead me somewhere. I opened it and stepped outside. The woods were gone. I was standing on a dirt road, with fields stretching out on either side. In the distance, I could see the lights of a town. I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost knocked me over. I didn't know how I had gotten here, but I didn't care. I was out. I started walking toward the town, my legs moving on their own. The road was long, but I didn't mind. I was just glad to be out of the woods. As I got closer, I could see the shapes of houses and cars. It looked like a normal, quiet town. I didn't know where I was, but I knew I could figure it out from here. When I reached the town, I found a gas station and asked the attendant where I was. He gave me a strange look but told me the name of the town. It was miles from where I had started, but I didn't care. I was just glad to be somewhere familiar. I called a cab and gave the driver the address of my car. He didn't ask any questions, and I was grateful for that. I didn't think I could explain what had happened even if I wanted to. When I got back to the trailhead, my car was still there, just like I had left it. I got in and sat there for a long time, The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but work kept getting in the way. Today, I finally had the time. The trail was one I hadn't done before, marked as moderate on the map I picked up at the ranger station. It wound through dense woods, up a steep ridge, and then back down into a valley. The map said it would take about 4 hours, but I figured I could do it in 3 if I kept a steady pace. I had my backpack with me, water, a few energy bars, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I thought I was prepared. The first mile was easy. The trail was wide, the ground firm under my boots. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. Birds chirped in the trees, and the occasional squirrel darted across the path. I felt good, strong. The kind of good where you forget about everything else, work, bills, the noise of the city. It was just me and the woods. But as I got deeper in, the trail started to change. The trees grew closer together, their branches twisting overhead like they were trying to block out the sun. The path narrowed, and the ground became uneven, littered with rocks and roots. I had to watch my step. The air felt heavier too, like it was pressing down on me. I told myself it was just the altitude, but the feeling didn't go away. I checked my watch. I had been hiking for about an hour and a half. According to the map, I should have been nearing the ridge by now, but I couldn't see it. The trees were too thick. I kept going, telling myself I was just being impatient, but with every step, the woods seemed to close in a little more. The birds had stopped singing. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the trail. Then I saw it. First, I thought it was just a shadow, but as I got closer, I realized it was a hole in the ground. A deep, dark pit right in the middle of the trail. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. I would have noticed something like that. I stopped and stared at it, my heart pounding. The edges were jagged, like the ground had just opened up. I took a step closer, peering over the edge. It was too dark to see how deep it went. I told myself to keep going. It was just a hole. Maybe it had been there all along, and I just hadn't seen it. But as I stepped around it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt colder now, and the silence was deafening. I quickened my pace, my eyes darting around the woods. Every shadow looked like it was moving. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, made me jump. I checked my watch again. 2 hours. I should have reached the ridge by now. I pulled out the map, but it didn't make sense. The trail was supposed to loop around, but I didn't remember any loops. I didn't remember any of this. The trees all looked the same, and the trail seemed to be leading me in circles. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I was just tired, that I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. But deep down, I knew something was off. The sun was almost gone now, the sky a deep orange. I needed to find the ridge before it got dark. I started walking faster, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. My legs ached, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The trail twisted and turned, and I felt like I was going in circles. The trees seemed to be closing in, their branches reaching out like claws. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my hands shaking. Then I saw it again, the hole. It was right in front of me just like before, but that was impossible. I had been walking for hours. I should have been miles away by now. I stared at it, my mind racing. How could it be the same hole? Unless I had been going in circles this whole time. But that didn't make sense. I had been following the trail. I hadn't turned around. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. My mouth was dry, my throat tight. I looked around, but the woods were too dark now to see anything clearly. The shadows were everywhere, moving and shifting like they were alive. I could hear my own breathing, loud and ragged. I needed to get out of here. I needed to find the ridge. I started running. My boots pounded against the ground, the sound echoing in the silence. Branches whipped at my face, but I didn't care. I just kept running, my eyes fixed on the trail ahead. But no matter how fast I ran, the hole kept appearing in front of me. It was like the trail was folding in on itself, like I was trapped in some kind of loop. I could feel panic rising in my chest, threatening to overwhelm me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Then I tripped. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, my face hitting the ground. Pain shot through my leg, and I felt something warm and wet on my forehead. Blood. I pushed myself up, my hands trembling. My leg hurt, but I could still move it. I had to keep going. I couldn't stay here. I got to my feet and started walking again, slower this time. My head was throbbing, and my leg felt like it was on fire. The trail was almost completely dark now, the last light of the sun fading fast. I pulled out my flashlight and turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't help much. The trees looked even more menacing in the harsh light, their shadows stretching out like long, bony fingers. I kept walking, my eyes fixed on the ground. I didn't want to see the hole again. I didn't want to see anything. I just wanted to get out of here. But no matter how far I walked, the trail never seemed to end. It just kept going, twisting and turning, leading me deeper into the woods. Then I heard it, a sound, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps. Someone or something was following me. I stopped, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped too. I turned around, shining the flashlight behind me. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the trail winding back into the trees. I started walking again, faster this time. The footsteps started again, keeping pace with me. I could hear them clearly now, crunching on the leaves and twigs. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, my chest tight with fear. I wanted to run, but my leg hurt too much. I could feel tears stinging my eyes, but I blinked them away. I couldn't afford to lose it now. The trail started to slope upward, and I realized I was finally reaching the ridge. Relief flooded through me, but it didn't last long. The footsteps were still there, closer now. I could hear them right behind me. I didn't dare look back. I just kept walking, my eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Then I saw it, the ridge. It was just ahead, the trees thinning out to reveal a rocky outcrop. I could see the sky, dark and full of stars. I almost cried with relief. I was going to make it. I was going to get out of here. But as I reached the ridge, I realized something was wrong. The trail didn't lead down into the valley like it was supposed to. It just ended, dropping off into nothing. I stood there, staring into the darkness. The map was wrong. The trail was wrong. Everything was wrong. The footsteps were right behind me now. I could feel them, like a presence at my back. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see what was there, but I had to. I had to know. I turned around. There was nothing there, just the trail winding back into the trees. The footsteps had stopped. The woods were silent again. I stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness. My heart was still pounding, my hands shaking, but the fear was gone, replaced by something else. Something colder, heavier. I didn't know what had happened. I didn't know if I had imagined it all, if I had just gotten lost and panicked. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back into those woods. I turned around and started walking along the ridge, looking for another way down. It took me a while, but I finally found a steep, rocky path that led into the valley. It wasn't easy and I slipped more than once, but I didn't care. I just kept going, my eyes fixed on the ground. When I finally reached the bottom, I could see the lights of the ranger station in the distance. I almost cried with relief. I was going to make it. I was going to get out of here. I walked the rest of the way in silence, my mind racing. I didn't know what had happened in those woods. I didn't know if I had imagined it all, if I had just gotten lost and panicked. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. When I got to the ranger station, the ranger on duty looked up from his desk. "You okay?" he asked, his voice concerned. I nodded, but I didn't say anything. I didn't trust my voice. I just handed him the map and walked out, my legs shaking. I got in my car and drove home, my mind still racing. I didn't know what had happened in those woods. I didn't know if I had imagined it all, if I had just gotten lost and panicked. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back, and I never did. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but work kept getting in the way. Today, though, I finally had the time. The trail was one I hadn't tried before, marked as moderate on the map. It wound through a dense forest, up a steep hill, and then down into a valley before looping back to the parking lot. I figured it would take me about 3 hours, maybe 4 if I took my time. I packed my bag with the essentials: water, a flashlight, a first aid kit, a protein bar, and my phone. I didn't expect to need much else. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with a light breeze that carried the scent of pine and damp earth. I parked my car at the trailhead and double-checked the map. The trail was clearly marked, and I felt confident I wouldn't get lost. I locked the car, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and started walking. The first part of the trail was easy, a wide path covered in pine needles. The trees were tall and close together, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. Birds chirped somewhere overhead, and the occasional rustle of leaves made me glance around, but it was always just a squirrel or a chipmunk. After about 30 minutes, the trail began to climb. The path narrowed and the trees grew thicker. The air felt cooler, and the light dimmed as the sun dipped lower. I stopped to take a sip of water and check my phone. No signal, which didn't surprise me. I wasn't worried. I had the map and the trail was well marked. I kept going, my boots crunching on the gravel and dirt. The climb was steeper than I expected. My legs started to burn, and my breath came in short, sharp bursts. I paused to catch my breath and looked back the way I'd come. The trees blocked most of the view, but I could see glimpses of the valley below. It was beautiful, peaceful. I took a few deep breaths and kept going. The higher I climbed, the quieter it became. The birds had stopped chirping, and even the wind seemed to die down. The only sound was my own breathing and the occasional snap of a twig under my boots. I started to feel a little uneasy, though I couldn't say why. It was just a hike after all. I'd done this plenty of times before, but something felt off. I reached the top of the hill and stopped to rest. The view was stunning. Rolling hills covered in trees, the sun casting long shadows across the landscape. I took a few photos with my phone, though I knew they wouldn't do it justice. I checked the map again. The trail was supposed to loop around and start heading back down, but I couldn't see any markers. I walked a little further, scanning the ground for the familiar signs. Nothing. I felt a pang of anxiety but pushed it down. I must have missed the turnoff. I decided to retrace my steps and look for it. I walked back the way I'd come, my eyes glued to the ground. After about 10 minutes, I still hadn't found the marker. My anxiety grew. I told myself to stay calm. I had water, food, and a flashlight. Even if I had to spend the night out here, I'd be fine. But as the sun dipped lower, the shadows grew longer, and the forest seemed to close in around me. I started to feel claustrophobic, even though I was out in the open. I kept walking, hoping to find the trail or at least a landmark I recognized. But everything looked the same: trees, rocks, more trees. My heart started to race, and my palms grew sweaty. I tried to take deep breaths, but it didn't help. I pulled out my phone again, hoping for a signal. Still nothing. I opened the map app, but it was useless without GPS. I cursed under my breath and shoved the phone back in my pocket. I kept walking, my pace quickening. The forest seemed darker now, the trees taller and more menacing. Every sound made me jump: a rustle in the underbrush, the creak of a branch. I told myself it was just animals, but my imagination ran wild. I started to run, my boots pounding on the ground. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my chest burned. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get out of there. The trees blurred together, and the ground seemed to tilt beneath me. I stumbled and fell, scraping my hands on the rough bark of a fallen log. I scrambled to my feet and kept running, my heart pounding in my ears. Finally, I burst into a clearing. I stopped, doubled over, trying to catch my breath. My legs felt like jelly, and my head spun. I looked around, hoping to see something familiar, but the clearing was empty, just a patch of grass surrounded by trees. I sank to my knees, my chest heaving. I was lost, really, truly lost. I sat there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The sun was almost gone, and the temperature was dropping fast. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and tried to think. I had to find shelter, someplace to spend the night. I couldn't keep wandering aimlessly in the dark. I got to my feet and started walking again, this time more slowly. I scanned the ground for anything that might help. A stream, a rock formation, anything. But the forest was eerily uniform, just trees and more trees. My flashlight was in my bag, but I didn't want to use it yet. I needed to save the batteries. As the last light faded, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere behind me. I froze, my heart pounding. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a cougar, but the sound was deeper, more menacing than anything I'd ever heard. I slowly turned around, my eyes straining to see in the dim light. First, I saw nothing, just shadows and trees. Then something moved, a dark shape low to the ground, slinking between the trees. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see it clearly, but it was big. Bigger than a dog, bigger than a wolf. It moved silently, its eyes glinting in the fading light. I took a step back, then another. The creature didn't move, just watched me with those glowing eyes. I turned and ran, my legs pumping as fast as they could. I didn't look back, didn't dare. I could hear it behind me, the sound of its paws hitting the ground, the low growl growing louder. My heart felt like it would burst, and my lungs burned. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away. I tripped over a root and went sprawling, my face hitting the ground. I scrambled to my feet, but the creature was on me before I could move. I felt its weight on my back, its hot breath on my neck. I screamed, a raw, primal sound, and thrashed wildly. My hand hit something hard, a rock. I grabbed it and swung blindly, hitting the creature in the side. It let out a yelp and backed off, but only for a moment. I got to my feet, the rock still in my hand. The creature circled me, its eyes never leaving mine. It was huge, with matted fur and teeth that gleamed in the moonlight. I tightened my grip on the rock and prepared to fight for my life. But then, something strange happened. The creature stopped, its head tilting to the side as if it heard something. It let out a low growl, then turned and disappeared into the trees. I stood there, shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't understand what had just happened, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I ran, my legs aching and my chest on fire. I didn't stop until I saw a light in the distance. It was faint, but it was there. I pushed myself harder, my feet pounding on the ground. As I got closer, I realized it was a cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the windows glowed with warm light. I stumbled to the door and pounded on it with my fists. The door opened, and a man stood there, holding a lantern. He was older, with a grizzled beard and a worn flannel shirt. He took one look at me and stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. I collapsed on the floor, my body shaking uncontrollably. The man knelt beside me, his hands rough but gentle as he checked me for injuries. "You're safe now," he said, his voice calm and steady. "You're safe." I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't stop shaking. The man helped me to a chair by the fire and wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. He handed me a cup of hot tea, and I sipped it slowly, the warmth spreading through my body. "What happened out there?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. How could I explain what I'd seen? How could I make him understand? I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. The man didn't press me. He just sat there, silent and steady, until I finally found my voice. "There was something," I said, my voice trembling. "In the woods. Chased me. I thought it was going to kill me." The man nodded, his expression grim. "You're not the first," he said. "People go missing out here all the time. They say it's the wilderness, but I know better. There's something out there, something that doesn't belong." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "What is it?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. The man shook his head. "I don't know," he said, "but it's been here for as long as I can remember. That's why I built sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but life kept getting in the way. Today, though, I finally had the time. The trail was one I'd never done before, a narrow path that wound through dense woods and up into the hills. It was supposed to be a 6-mile loop, but I wasn't worried. I had my backpack with water, snacks, a flashlight, and a map. I was ready. The first mile was easy. The trail was well marked, and the woods were quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. The air was cool, and the smell of pine was strong. I felt good, my legs strong, my breathing steady. I kept a steady pace, my boots crunching on the dirt path. The trees were tall, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. By the time I reached the 2nd-mile marker, the trail began to climb. The incline was steep, and my legs started to burn. I slowed my pace, taking deeper breaths. The trees here were thinner, and I could see patches of sky through the branches. The sun was lower now, and the light was starting to turn golden. I checked my watch. It was later than I thought. I had started later than I planned, and I knew I needed to pick up the pace if I wanted to finish before dark. The 3rd mile was harder. The trail narrowed, and the trees grew closer together. The underbrush was thick, and I had to push through branches that reached out like fingers. The air felt heavier here, damp and cool. I could hear the sound of running water somewhere nearby, but I couldn't see it. The map showed a stream that crossed the trail, but I hadn't reached it yet. I kept walking, my eyes on the ground, watching for roots and rocks that could trip me. When I finally reached the stream, the sun was almost touching the horizon. The water was clear and cold, rushing over smooth stones. I knelt down and filled my water bottle, taking a long drink. The water was refreshing, and I splashed some on my face to cool off. I looked at the map again. The trail crossed the stream and then continued uphill for another mile before looping back down. I had about 2 miles left, but the light was fading fast. I knew I needed to hurry. I crossed the stream carefully, stepping on the rocks to keep my boots dry. The other side was even steeper, and the trail was harder to follow. The markers were fewer here, and the underbrush was thicker. I had to stop several times to check the map and make sure I was still on the right path. The woods felt different now, darker and more closed in. The trees seemed taller, their shadows longer. The air was cooler, and I could feel a slight breeze that made the leaves rustle. It was a sound I had found comforting earlier, but now it felt eerie, like whispers in the wind. By the time I reached the 4th mile, the sun was gone. The sky was a deep blue, and the first stars were starting to appear. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The trail was harder to see now, and I had to move slowly, shining the light ahead to make sure I didn't miss a turn. The woods were quiet, too quiet. The birds had stopped singing, and even the rustle of leaves had died down. The only sound was my own breathing and the crunch of my boots on the dirt. I kept walking, my eyes on the trail. The beam of my flashlight caught something on the ground, and I stopped. It was a footprint, fresh and clear in the dirt. I knelt down to look at it. It was larger than mine, and the tread was different. Someone else had been here recently. I stood up and looked around, shining the light into the trees. The woods were dark and still, and I couldn't see anything. I told myself it was probably just another hiker, but the thought didn't make me feel any better. I kept moving, but now I was more alert, my senses heightened. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. The trail was getting harder to follow, and I had to stop several times to check the map. The markers were few and far between, and I was starting to worry that I had taken a wrong turn. The woods felt different now, more oppressive, like they were closing in around me. The air was colder, and I could feel a chill running down my spine. I reached the 5th-mile marker, but it didn't make me feel any better. The trail was supposed to start looping back down now, but it didn't feel like I was going downhill. The trees were still thick, and the underbrush was dense. I could hear the sound of running water again, but it was faint, like it was far away. I checked the map again, but it was hard to read in the dim light of the flashlight. I was starting to feel lost, and the thought made my chest tighten. I kept walking, my pace slower now. The beam of the flashlight caught something ahead, and I stopped. There was something on the trail, something dark and lumpy. I moved closer, shining the light on it. It was a backpack, old and worn, the fabric torn in places. It was lying on the ground like someone had dropped it. I knelt down and picked it up. It was heavy, and when I opened it, I found a water bottle, some food, and a map. The map was similar to mine, but it was older, the paper yellowed and brittle. There was a name written on the inside flap, but it was too faded to read. I stood up and looked around, shining the light into the trees. The woods were dark and silent, and I couldn't see anything. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I dropped the backpack. I didn't want to think about who it belonged to or why it was here. I just wanted to get out of these woods. I kept walking, but now I was more scared. The trail was harder to follow, and I had to stop several times to check the map. The markers were few and far between, and I was starting to worry that I had taken a wrong turn. The woods felt different now, more oppressive, like they were closing in around me. The air was colder, and I could feel a chill running down my spine. I reached the 6th-mile marker, but it didn't make me feel any better. The trail was supposed to start looping back down now, but it didn't feel like I was going downhill. The trees were still thick, and the underbrush was dense. I could hear the sound of running water again, but it was faint, like it was far away. I checked the map again, but it was hard to read in the dim light of the flashlight. I was starting to feel lost, and the thought made my chest tighten. I kept walking, my pace slower now. The beam of the flashlight caught something ahead, and I stopped. There was something on the trail, something dark and lumpy. I moved closer, shining the light on it. It was a backpack, old and worn, the fabric torn in places. It was lying on the ground like someone had dropped it. I knelt down and picked it up. It was heavy, and when I opened it, I found a water bottle, some food, and a map. The map was similar to mine, but it was older, the paper yellowed and brittle. There was a name written on the inside flap, but it was too faded to read. I stood up and looked around, shining the light into the trees. The woods were dark and silent, and I couldn't see anything. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I dropped the backpack. I didn't want to think about who it belonged to or why it was here. I just wanted to get out of these woods. I kept walking, but now I was more scared. The trail was harder to follow, and I had to stop several times to check the map. The markers were few and far between, and I was starting to worry that I had taken a wrong turn. The woods felt different now, more oppressive, like they were closing in around me. The air was colder, and I could feel a chill running down my spine. I reached the 6th-mile marker, but it didn't make me feel any better. The trail was supposed to start looping back down now, but it didn't feel like I was going downhill. The trees were still thick, and the underbrush was dense. I could hear the sound of running water again, but it was faint, like it was far away. I checked the map again, but it was hard to read in the dim light of the flashlight. I was starting to feel lost, and the thought made my chest tighten. I kept walking, my pace slower now. The beam of the flashlight caught something ahead, and I stopped. There was something on the trail, something dark and lumpy. I moved closer, shining the light on it. It was a backpack, old and worn, the fabric torn in places. It was lying on the ground like someone had dropped it. I knelt down and picked it up. It was heavy, and when I opened it, I found a water bottle, some food, and a map. The map was similar to mine, but it was older, the paper yellowed and brittle. There was a name written on the inside flap, but it was too faded to read. I stood up and looked around, shining the light into the trees. The woods were dark and silent, and I couldn't see anything. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I dropped the backpack. I didn't want to think about who it belonged to or why it was here. I just wanted to get out of these woods. I kept walking, but now I was more scared. The trail was harder to follow, and I had to stop several times to check the map. The markers were few and far between, and I was starting to worry that I had taken a wrong turn. The woods felt different now, more oppressive, like they were closing in around me. The air was colder, and I could feel a chill running down my spine. I reached the 6th-mile marker, but it didn't make me feel any better. The trail was supposed to The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but work kept getting in the way. Today, though, I finally had the time. The trail was supposed to be a simple loop, something I could finish before dark. I had my backpack with me, water, a few snacks, a flashlight, and a light jacket just in case. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, and the trees were just starting to turn colors. It felt like the kind of day where nothing could go wrong. I parked my car at the trailhead, double-checked my gear, and started walking. The first mile was easy. The path was well marked, and the forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. I felt good, strong, like I could walk forever. The air smelled fresh, like pine and earth, and I took deep breaths, savoring it. I didn't see anyone else on the trail, but that didn't bother me. I liked the solitude. By the time I reached the halfway point, the sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the ground. I checked my watch. I had about 2 hours of daylight left, which should have been plenty of time to finish the loop. But as I walked, I started to notice things that made me uneasy. The trail markers seemed farther apart than I remembered, and the path was getting narrower, more overgrown. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I had taken this trail before and knew where I was going. But the further I went, the more I began to doubt myself. The trees seemed closer together, their branches twisting overhead like they were trying to block out the sky. The air felt heavier, harder to breathe. I stopped for a moment to take a sip of water and looked around. Everything looked the same, trees, rocks, more trees. I couldn't see any landmarks, nothing to tell me where I was. My heart started to beat a little faster, but I pushed the feeling down. I was fine. I just needed to keep going. I kept walking, but the trail kept getting harder to follow. At one point, I had to climb over a fallen tree, its trunk thick and covered in moss. My hands were dirty, and I wiped them on my pants, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread in my chest. The sun was almost gone now, and the forest was getting darker. I pulled out my flashlight and turned it on, but the beam seemed weak, barely cutting through the gloom. I don't know how long I walked like that, following what I thought was the trail, but it felt like hours. My legs were tired, and my feet hurt. I stopped again, leaning against a tree to catch my breath. My mouth was dry, and I realized I was almost out of water. I looked around, trying to find something, anything, that would tell me where I was. But all I saw were trees, endless trees, and the darkness closing in. That's when I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps, not mine, someone else's. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I listened, straining to hear over the sound of my own breathing. There it was again, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the snap of a twig. Someone was out there in the woods with me. I didn't know whether to call out or stay quiet. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. Maybe it was another hiker, someone who could help me. Or maybe it was something else. The footsteps were getting closer. I could hear them now, slow and deliberate, like whoever it was knew exactly where I was. I turned off my flashlight, hoping to hide in the darkness, but it was too late. I could feel them, feel their presence, like a weight pressing down on me. My hands were shaking, and I gripped the flashlight tighter, ready to use it as a weapon if I had to. And then I saw them, a figure standing just at the edge of the trees. I couldn't make out their face, just a dark shape against the darker background. They didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, watching me. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stare back, waiting for them to make the first move. But they didn't. They just stood there, silent and still, like they were waiting for something. I don't know how long we stayed like that, locked in that terrible silence, but it felt like forever. And then, slowly, they started to move. Not towards me, but away, back into the trees. I watched them go, my heart still racing, until they disappeared into the darkness. I didn't wait to see if they would come back. I turned and ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that place. My flashlight bounced in my hand, the beam jerking wildly as I ran. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept running until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. When I finally collapsed, I was somewhere I didn't recognize. The trees were thinner here, and I could see the sky through the branches. The moon was out, casting a pale light over everything. I lay there for a long time, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had happened. But there was no sense to be made. All I knew was that I was lost, and I was alone. I don't know how I made it out of the woods that night. I remember walking, stumbling, falling, getting back up again. I remember the cold, the fear, the exhaustion. But somehow I kept going. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it. A light, faint but real, through the trees. I ran towards it, tears streaming down my face, and when I finally broke through the tree line, I saw the road. My car was there, just where I had left it. I didn't stop to think. I got in the car, started the engine, and drove. I didn't look back, didn't slow down until I was miles away, back in the safety of the city. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. What would I say? That I got lost in the woods and thought I was being followed? They would think I was crazy. Maybe I was. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know that I'll never go back to that trail again. The woods are supposed to be a place of peace, of beauty. But not for me. Not anymore. For me, they'll always be a place of darkness, of fear, of something I can't explain. And that's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but work kept getting in the way. Today, I finally had the time. The trail was supposed to be a simple loop, about 6 miles through the woods, with a few steep climbs but nothing too challenging. I had done my research, packed my bag with water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a flashlight just in case. I even checked the weather, clear skies, no chance of rain. Perfect conditions. Or so I thought. The trailhead was easy to find, marked by a wooden sign with the name of the trail carved into it. The parking lot was empty, which didn't surprise me. It was a weekday, and most people were probably still at work. I locked my car, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and started walking. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your nose and makes your breath visible. I zipped up my jacket and adjusted my gloves, feeling the crunch of leaves under my boots as I moved deeper into the woods. The first mile was uneventful. The trail was well marked, with orange blazes painted on the trees every so often to keep hikers on the right path. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. I felt good, my legs strong, my breathing steady. The solitude was comforting, a break from the noise of the city. I kept a steady pace, my eyes scanning the ground ahead for roots or rocks that might trip me up. By the time I reached the second mile, the sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows across the trail. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches twisting and gnarled like skeletal fingers. I checked my watch, 4:30 p.m. I had plenty of time before sunset, or so I thought. The trail was supposed to take about 3 hours, and I was making good time. But as I walked, I began to notice things that made me uneasy. The first thing was the silence. The birds had stopped singing, and the forest felt unnaturally still. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the trail. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I saw the footprints. They were fresh, the edges of the impressions still sharp in the dirt. Someone had been here recently, and they were heading in the same direction as me. I paused, looking around, but there was no one in sight. The footprints were large, bigger than mine, and the stride was long. Whoever made them was tall, and they were moving fast. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I told myself it was nothing. Just another hiker, probably ahead of me on the trail. I kept walking, but now I was more aware of my surroundings. The trees seemed darker, their shadows deeper. The trail began to narrow, the underbrush creeping closer to the edges. I could feel my heart rate picking up, my breath coming a little faster. I told myself to stay calm, to focus on the trail. But then I saw the second set of footprints. These were different, smaller, more erratic, as if the person had been running. They overlapped with the first set, and I could see where the larger footprints had veered off the trail into the woods. My stomach tightened, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I stopped, listening, but the forest was silent. Too silent. I pulled out my flashlight, even though it wasn't fully dark yet. The beam of light cut through the gloom, illuminating the trail ahead. I could see where the smaller footprints ended abruptly, as if the person had disappeared. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe they had left the trail, gone off into the woods. But why? And where were they now? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I needed to keep moving. The trail looped back to the parking lot, and I was closer to the end than the beginning. I couldn't turn back now. I adjusted my backpack and started walking again, my eyes darting from side to side, scanning the trees for any movement. The trail began to climb, the ground growing steeper and more uneven. My legs burned with the effort, but I pushed on, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The trees thinned out as I reached the top of the ridge, and I could see the sun dipping below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It would be dark soon. I paused at the top of the ridge, looking out over the forest. The view was breathtaking, but I couldn't enjoy it. My eyes were drawn to something on the ground, just off the trail. It was a piece of fabric, torn and dirty, caught on a branch. I walked over to it, my heart pounding. It was a piece of a jacket, dark blue, with a strip of reflective tape. I recognized it instantly. It was the same kind of jacket I was wearing. I felt a surge of panic, my mind racing. Had someone been here before me? Had they been hurt? I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone, just the piece of fabric, fluttering in the breeze. I stuffed it into my pocket and kept walking, my pace quickening. I needed to get out of here. The trail began to descend, the ground slippery with fallen leaves. I had to be careful, my boots sliding on the wet earth. The trees closed in again, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out what little light was left. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The shadows seemed to move, shifting and twisting as I walked. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And then I heard it, a sound, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps, crunching on the leaves behind me. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I listened, straining to hear over the sound of my own breathing. There it was again, closer this time. I turned, shining my flashlight behind me, but the beam only illuminated empty trail. The footsteps stopped. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon. But deep down, I knew better. Animals didn't sound like that. They didn't walk with such purpose, such weight. I turned and started walking again, faster this time. The footsteps followed, keeping pace with me. I could hear them, steady and relentless, just out of sight. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. I couldn't outrun them, not on this terrain. I couldn't hide, there was nowhere to go. My only option was to keep moving, to get to the end of the trail as quickly as possible. I picked up my pace, my boots pounding on the dirt. The footsteps behind me quickened, matching my speed. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, threatening to overwhelm me. My legs were burning, my lungs aching, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. The trail twisted and turned, the trees pressing in on all sides. I could see the beam of my flashlight bouncing ahead of me, illuminating the path. But no matter how fast I went, the footsteps stayed right behind me, never closer, never farther away. And then suddenly the trail opened up. I could see the parking lot ahead, the outline of my car just visible in the fading light. I almost cried out in relief, my legs pumping as I sprinted the last few yards. I reached the car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked out the window, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the empty trail, the darkening forest. I started the car, my hands still trembling on the wheel. I pulled out of the parking lot, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The road was empty, no headlights behind me. I drove faster, the trees whipping past in a blur. I didn't relax until I was back on the highway, the lights of the city in the distance. It wasn't until I got home that I realized I still had the piece of fabric in my pocket. I pulled it out, staring at it in the light of my kitchen. It was definitely from a jacket like mine, but it wasn't mine. I hadn't torn my jacket, hadn't lost any pieces. So whose was it? I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every creak of the house made me jump. I kept thinking about the footsteps, the feeling of being followed. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I had let the isolation and the darkness get to me. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I went back to the trailhead. I don't know why. Maybe to prove to myself that it had all been in my head. The parking lot was empty, just like the day before. I walked to the trailhead, my heart pounding as I looked at the path leading into the woods. I didn't go in, couldn't. Instead, I called the park ranger. I told him about the footprints, the piece of fabric, the footsteps. He listened patiently, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He said he would check it out, but I knew he wouldn't find anything. There would be no footprints, no signs of anyone else on the trail, just like there had been no one following me. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but work kept getting in the way. Finally, I had a free day and I wasn't going to waste it. The trail was one I hadn't done before, marked as moderate on the map I picked up at the ranger station. It wound through dense woods, up a steep ridge, and then looped back down to the parking lot. 6 miles total. I figured I had enough daylight left to finish before dark. I threw my backpack over my shoulders, tightened the straps, and started walking. The air was cool, the kind of cool that makes you feel alive. The trees were tall, their leaves filtering the sunlight into patches of gold on the forest floor. The trail was narrow, just wide enough for one person, and the dirt was soft under my boots. I could hear birds chirping, the occasional rustle of leaves as some small animal darted away. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that makes you forget about everything else. I walked for about an hour, maybe more. The trail started to climb, and the trees thinned out a bit. I could see the ridge ahead, jagged and dark against the sky. The sun was lower now, and the shadows were getting longer. I checked my watch. I still had plenty of time. I kept walking, my breath coming a little harder as the trail got steeper. My legs were starting to burn, but it was a good burn, the kind that reminds you you're alive. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, something tricking my eyes. But as I got closer, I realized it was a backpack. It was lying on the side of the trail, half hidden by some bushes. I stopped and stared at it for a moment. It was a nice backpack, the kind hikers use with lots of pockets and straps. It looked new, like it hadn't been out here long. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight. The woods were quiet, too quiet. The birds had stopped chirping. I crouched down and reached for the backpack. It was heavier than I expected. I unzipped the main compartment and looked inside. There was a water bottle, a jacket, a map, and a few energy bars. Normal stuff. But then I saw something else. Something that made my stomach twist. It was a phone, an expensive one, the kind with a big screen. The screen was cracked, and there was dried blood on the case. I dropped the backpack and stood up quickly. My heart was pounding now, and I could feel the sweat on the back of my neck. I looked around again, but the woods were still empty. The sun was almost gone, and the shadows were merging into one big darkness. I knew I should turn back, but something made me keep going. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something else, something deeper and darker. The trail got steeper and the trees got thicker. The air was colder now, and I could see my breath. I kept walking, my eyes scanning the ground, the trees, the shadows. I don't know what I was looking for, but I knew I would recognize it when I saw it. Then I saw the shoe. It was just one shoe, a hiking boot, lying on the trail. It was scuffed and dirty, like it had been there for a while. I picked it up and turned it over. There was blood on the inside, dried and dark. I dropped the shoe and kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest. The trail was getting harder to see now, the shadows swallowing it up. I pulled out my flashlight and turned it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it didn't make me feel any better. I don't know how long I walked. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. The trail was steep and narrow, and the trees were so close I could feel their branches brushing against me. The air was cold and damp, and I could hear the sound of my own breathing, loud and uneven. My legs were tired, and my back was sore from the weight of my backpack. But I kept walking, one foot in front of the other, my eyes fixed on the beam of light from my flashlight. Then I saw the tent. It was a small tent, the kind hikers use for overnight trips. It was set up in a small clearing just off the trail. The fabric was torn, and one of the poles was bent. There was no light inside, no movement. I stopped and stared at it for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to go closer, but I knew I had to. I stepped off the trail and walked toward the tent. The ground was soft and wet, and my boots sank into the mud. The air smelled damp and earthy, and I could hear the sound of water dripping from the trees. I stopped a few feet from the tent and shone my flashlight on it. The fabric was dirty and stained, and there were holes in the sides. I could see something inside, something dark and shapeless. I took a deep breath and reached for the zipper. My hands were shaking, and it took me a few tries to get it open. The sound of the zipper was loud in the quiet woods, and it made my skin crawl. I pulled the flap open and shone my flashlight inside. There was a body. It was a man, or what was left of a man. He was lying on his back, his eyes wide open and staring at nothing. His face was pale and gaunt, and there were deep cuts on his arms and legs. His clothes were torn and bloody, and there was a knife lying next to him, its blade dark with dried blood. The smell hit me then, the smell of death, and I stumbled back, my stomach churning. I turned and ran, my feet slipping in the mud. I didn't look back, didn't stop. I just ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The trees were a blur, the trail a dark ribbon in front of me. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away. I don't know how long I ran. Felt like forever, but it was probably only a few minutes. My legs were burning, and my lungs felt like they were on fire. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, loud and uneven, and the sound of my boots hitting the ground. The woods were dark and silent, and the only light was the beam from my flashlight, bouncing wildly as I ran. Then I saw the car. It was parked at the edge of the trail, just where I had left it. The sight of it made me stop, my legs giving out underneath me. I fell to my knees, my chest heaving, my hands shaking. I could see the parking lot beyond the car, the streetlights glowing in the distance. I was safe. I don't know how long I sat there, my knees in the dirt, my hands on the ground. My heart was still pounding, and my breath was still coming in short, ragged gasps. But I was safe. I was out of the woods. I stood up slowly, my legs trembling. I walked to the car and opened the door. The interior light came on, and I saw my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face was pale, my eyes wide and scared. I looked like I had seen a ghost, but I hadn't. What I had seen was real, too real. I got in the car and started the engine. The sound of it was loud in the quiet night, and it made me jump. I put the car in gear and drove away, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. I didn't look back. I drove straight to the police station. It was a small building, just a few blocks from the trailhead. The lights were on, and I could see a few cars parked outside. I pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine. My hands were still shaking, and my heart was still pounding, but I knew I had to do this. I got out of the car and walked into the station. The air inside was warm, and the smell of coffee filled the room. There was a desk in the middle of the room, and a police officer sitting behind it. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes narrowing as he took in my appearance. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My throat was dry, and my tongue felt like it was stuck to the roof of my mouth. I took a deep breath and tried again. "I found something," I said, my voice shaking. "In the woods. A body." The officer's eyes widened, and he stood up quickly. He came around the desk and led me to a chair. I sat down, my legs giving out underneath me. He handed me a cup of water, and I drank it greedily, the cool liquid soothing my dry throat. "Start from the beginning," he said, his voice calm but firm. I told him everything: the backpack, the shoe, the tent, the body. I told him about the blood, the knife, the smell. I told him about running, about the car, about driving here. He listened quietly, his eyes never leaving mine. When I was done, he nodded and stood up. "Stay here," he said. "I'll be right back." He walked away, and I sat there, my hands still shaking, my heart still pounding. I could hear voices in the background, the sound of phones ringing, the sound of footsteps. The room was warm, but I felt cold, cold to the bone. The officer came back a few minutes later, followed by 2 other officers. They were dressed in uniforms, their faces serious. One of them had a map in his hands, and he spread it out on the desk in front of me. "Can you show us where you were?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. I nodded and pointed to the trailhead on the map. I traced the trail with my finger, showing them where I had found the backpack, the shoe, the tent. They listened quietly, their eyes following my finger as it moved across the map. "We'll check it out," the first officer said. "Stay here." They left, and I sat there. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but work kept getting in the way. Today, though, I finally had the time. The trail was supposed to be a simple loop, about 5 miles through the woods, with a few steep climbs but nothing too challenging. I had done my research, packed my bag with water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a flashlight just in case. I even checked the weather: clear skies, no chance of rain. Perfect conditions, or so I thought. The trailhead was easy to find, marked by a wooden sign with the name of the trail carved into it. The parking lot was empty, which didn't surprise me. It was a weekday, and most people were probably still at work. I locked my car, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and started walking. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that makes you feel alive, and the leaves crunched under my boots. For the first mile or so, everything was exactly as I expected. The trail was well marked, the trees were tall and peaceful, and the only sounds were the occasional chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the wind. But then, something changed. It was subtle at first, just a feeling in the pit of my stomach, like I was being watched. I stopped and looked around, but there was nothing, no one, just the trees and the trail. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. I kept walking, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got stronger. My heart started to beat a little faster, and my palms felt sweaty even though the air was cool. I told myself it was just the isolation, the fact that I was alone in the woods. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The trail began to narrow, the trees closing in on either side. The sunlight filtered through the branches in thin, golden beams, but it didn't reach the ground. The forest floor was dark, covered in a thick layer of dead leaves and pine needles. I could hear my own breathing, loud and uneven, and the sound of my boots hitting the dirt. Every step felt heavier than the last, like I was walking through mud. I kept telling myself to turn back, to go back to the car, but something kept me moving forward. Curiosity, stubbornness, I don't know, but I couldn't stop. The trail started to climb and the air got thinner. My legs burned with the effort, and my breath came in short, ragged gasps. I stopped to take a drink of water, but my hands were shaking so badly that I spilled half of it down my shirt. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand and kept going. The trees were so close together now that I had to turn sideways to get through some parts of the trail. The branches scratched at my arms and face, leaving thin red lines that stung in the cool air. And then I saw it. A clearing up ahead, just a few yards away. Relief flooded through me. Finally, a break from the oppressive closeness of the trees. I quickened my pace, eager to reach the open space. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The clearing wasn't natural. The trees had been cut down, their stumps jagged and raw. The ground was torn up, like something had been digging there. And in the center of the clearing was a hole. A deep, dark hole that seemed to go on forever. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. The hole was about 6 feet across, and the edges were rough like they had been dug by hand. I couldn't see the bottom, no matter how hard I squinted. It was just black. I took a step closer, then another, until I was standing right on the edge. My stomach churned, and I felt dizzy, like I was gonna fall in. I took a step back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. And then I heard it, a sound, low and guttural, coming from the hole. It wasn't an animal sound. It wasn't a human sound. It was something else, something I couldn't identify. My skin crawled, and every hair on my body stood on end. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that hole as possible, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, rooted to the spot, staring into the darkness. The sound came again, louder this time, and I felt a rush of cold air coming up from the hole. It smelled like decay, like something dead and rotting. My stomach turned, and I thought I was going to be sick. I forced myself to take a step back, then another, until I was at the edge of the clearing. The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, from deep within the hole, I heard a scraping sound, like something was climbing up the walls. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran, crashing through the trees, not caring about the branches that slapped at my face and arms. I could hear something behind me, something big and heavy, moving through the underbrush. I didn't look back. I just ran, my heart pounding in my ears, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trail was a blur, and I stumbled more than once, but I kept going. I had to get out of there. I don't know how long I ran. Felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. All I know is that when I finally burst out of the trees and into the parking lot, the sun was setting, and the sky was a deep, bloody red. I collapsed against my car, my legs shaking so badly that I could barely stand. I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with sweat, and finally managed to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and sat there, trembling, for what felt like forever. I didn't go back to that trail. I didn't even tell anyone about what happened. Who would believe me? But sometimes, late at night, I think about that hole and the thing that was climbing out of it. And I wonder if it's still there, waiting for the next hiker to come along. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but life kept getting in the way. Today, though, I was determined. The trail was one I hadn't tried before, a winding path through dense woods that promised a view of the valley below. I packed my bag the night before: water, a few energy bars, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and a map. I didn't think I'd need most of it, but it felt good to be prepared. The weather was perfect, crisp and cool, with just enough sunlight filtering through the trees to keep things warm. I parked my car at the trailhead, locked it, and took a deep breath of the fresh, pine-scented air. This was going to be a good day. The first hour of the hike was easy. The trail was well marked, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves as small animals darted through the underbrush. I felt strong, my legs moving steadily, my breathing even. The path began to climb, and the trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. It was darker here, but not in a way that felt threatening. It was peaceful, quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. I checked my map occasionally, but the trail was straightforward, and I didn't think I could get lost. The markers were clear, little yellow rectangles nailed to trees at regular intervals. I passed a few hikers early on, but as I went deeper into the woods, I didn't see anyone else. That was fine with me. I liked the solitude. It gave me time to think, to clear my head. The further I went, the more the trail narrowed, the ground becoming uneven with roots and rocks. I had to watch my step, but it wasn't anything I couldn't handle. By the time I reached the halfway point, the sun was almost gone. The sky was a deep orange, and the shadows in the woods were growing longer. I stopped to take a drink of water and check the map again. According to the trail markers, I was on the right path, but something felt off. The woods seemed quieter than before, the usual sounds of birds and animals gone. I shook it off, telling myself I was just imagining things. The forest was always quieter at dusk. I kept going, my pace a little faster now, eager to reach the viewpoint before it got too dark. The trail began to climb more steeply, and the trees thinned out, giving way to rocky outcroppings. I could see the valley below, the lights of the town twinkling in the distance. It was beautiful, but I didn't stop to admire it. The sun was almost down, and I needed to get to the viewpoint and back before it got too dark. I didn't want to be caught out here at night, even though I had my flashlight. The woods were different at night, and not in a good way. I reached the viewpoint just as the last light was fading from the sky. The view was incredible. The valley spread out below me like a patchwork quilt, the lights of the town glowing like fireflies. I took a few pictures, then turned to head back. That's when I noticed it. The trail markers were gone. I looked around, but there was no sign of the little yellow rectangles. I told myself I must have missed them, that they were just hard to see in the fading light. I started back the way I came, but the trail didn't look familiar. The rocks and trees all looked the same, and the path seemed to twist and turn in ways I didn't remember. I pulled out my map and tried to orient myself, but it was no use. The trail wasn't marked, and I couldn't tell where I was. I felt a pang of panic, but I pushed it down. I wasn't lost. I just needed to retrace my steps. I started walking, keeping an eye out for anything familiar. The woods were getting darker, the shadows deeper. I turned on my flashlight, but the beam seemed weak, barely cutting through the gloom. I kept walking, but the trail just kept going, winding through the trees with no end in sight. After what felt like hours, I stopped. My legs were tired, and my throat was dry. I took a sip of water, but it didn't help much. I was starting to feel scared, but I told myself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. I needed to think. I looked around, trying to find something, anything, that would tell me where I was. The trees all looked the same, tall and dark, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground was covered in a thick layer of leaves, and the air was cold, colder than it should have been. I decided to keep going, hoping the trail would eventually lead me back to the trailhead. But the further I went, the more lost I felt. The woods seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing closer, the shadows deepening. I could hear things now, sounds that made my skin crawl. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, something moving in the darkness. I told myself it was just an animal, but the sounds were too loud, too close. I picked up my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The trail began to slope downward, and I thought maybe I was finally heading back toward the valley. But the path was rough, the ground slick with fallen leaves. I slipped and fell, my flashlight tumbling out of my hand. I scrambled to my feet, my hands scraping against the rough bark of a tree. I grabbed the flashlight and turned it on, but the beam was flickering now, barely illuminating the path ahead. I kept going, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The sounds were closer now, and I could feel something watching me. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. I turned my head, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows. It was big, whatever it was, and it was coming toward me. I ran, my feet slipping on the wet leaves, my heart pounding in my ears. The trail twisted and turned, and I couldn't tell if I was going in circles or if I was actually getting somewhere. The flashlight died, and I was plunged into darkness. I stopped, my chest heaving, my legs trembling. I could hear it now, whatever it was, moving through the trees, getting closer. I felt like I was going to scream, but I couldn't. I just stood there, frozen, waiting for whatever was out there to find me. And then, just when I thought it was all over, I saw a light. It was faint, but it was there, flickering through the trees. I ran toward it, my legs screaming in protest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The light grew brighter, and I realized it was a campfire. I stumbled into the clearing, my legs giving out beneath me. I fell to my knees, my hands sinking into the soft earth. I looked up, and there, sitting by the fire, was a man. He was older, with a grizzled beard and a worn-out jacket. He didn't say anything, just nodded toward the fire. I crawled closer, the warmth of the flames washing over me. I didn't ask him how he got there or why he was in the woods. I didn't care. I was just glad to be out of the darkness. The man handed me a cup of something hot, and I drank it without thinking. It burned my throat, but it felt good. I sat there for what felt like hours, just staring into the fire, my body slowly warming up. The man didn't say much, just sat there, his eyes on the flames. Eventually, I felt strong enough to stand. I thanked him, though he didn't respond, and started walking again. This time, the trail was clear, the markers easy to see in the light of the fire. I didn't look back, didn't want to see if the man was still there. I just kept walking, my eyes on the path ahead. When I finally reached the trailhead, the sky was beginning to lighten. I could see my car in the distance, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I got in, started the engine, and drove away. I didn't look back at the woods, didn't want to think about what had happened. I just wanted to get home, to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. It wasn't until later, when I was safe in my house, that I realized something. The man by the fire hadn't had a tent or a backpack. There had been no sign of a campsite, no gear, nothing. Just him and the fire, and the cup he had given me. It had been warm, but there had been no pot, no stove, nothing to heat it with. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that I had been lucky to find him. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I didn't go back to those woods, not ever. And I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. Some things are better left unsaid. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but work kept getting in the way. Today, though, I finally had the time. The trail was one I hadn't done before, a path that wound through dense woods and up into the hills. It was supposed to be challenging, but rewarding, the kind of hike that makes you feel alive. I packed my bag the night before: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a map. I didn't think I'd need most of it, but it's better to be safe than sorry. The air was crisp when I started, the kind of cold that bites at your nose and makes your breath visible. The trailhead was easy to find, marked by a wooden sign with the name of the trail carved into it. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and it disappeared quickly into the trees. I adjusted my backpack, took a deep breath, and started walking. The first hour was uneventful. The woods were quiet, the only sounds the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The trees were tall, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. It felt like walking through a tunnel, the world shrinking down to just the path in front of me. I kept a steady pace, my eyes scanning the ground for roots or rocks that might trip me up. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a scent that reminded me of camping trips when I was a kid. As I walked, the trail began to climb. The incline was gradual at first, but it quickly became steeper. My legs started to burn, and I could feel the weight of my backpack pulling at my shoulders. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, leaning against a tree. The bark was rough against my palm, and I could feel the cold seeping through my gloves. I took a sip of water, the liquid cool and refreshing, and then I kept going. The higher I climbed, the more the landscape changed. The trees thinned out, replaced by rocky outcroppings and patches of scrubby grass. The wind picked up, biting at my face and making my eyes water. I pulled my hat down tighter and kept moving. The trail was harder to follow now, the markers less frequent. I had to stop several times to check my map, making sure I hadn't taken a wrong turn. The last thing I wanted was to get lost. By the time I reached the top of the ridge, the sun was almost gone. The sky was a deep orange, streaked with purple and pink. The view was incredible, rolling hills stretching out as far as I could see, the trees below looking like a sea of green. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. It was worth the climb, but as I turned to start my descent, I realized something was wrong. The trail wasn't where it was supposed to be. I checked my map again, but it didn't make sense. According to the map, the trail should have looped back down the other side of the ridge, but there was nothing there, just rocks and more rocks. I felt a pang of panic in my chest, but I pushed it down. I just needed to retrace my steps. I'd find the trail again. I started walking back the way I came, my eyes scanning the ground for any sign of the path. But the light was fading fast, and everything looked different in the dimming light. The rocks all looked the same, and the trees seemed to close in around me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I told myself to stay calm, to think clearly, but the panic was creeping in, making it hard to focus. I kept walking, hoping I'd find the trail, but the further I went, the more lost I felt. The woods were getting darker, the shadows lengthening and merging together. I pulled out my flashlight, but the beam was weak, barely cutting through the gloom. I could hear the wind howling through the trees, the sound eerie and unsettling. My mind started playing tricks on me, imagining shapes in the shadows, hearing whispers in the wind. I shook my head, trying to clear it, but the fear was taking hold. I don't know how long I walked, but it felt like hours. My legs were aching, my feet sore and blistered. My water was running low, and I was starting to feel lightheaded. I knew I needed to stop to rest, but I was afraid if I did, I'd never get up again. The woods felt alive, like they were closing in on me, trying to swallow me whole. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on me, suffocating me. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go on anymore, I saw it, a light. At first, I thought it was my imagination, another trick of my mind. But as I got closer, I realized it was real. A small cabin, tucked away in the trees. The windows were glowing with a warm, inviting light, and smoke was curling up from the chimney. I almost cried with relief. I stumbled towards the cabin, my legs barely holding me up. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, stepping inside. The warmth hit me like a wave, thawing my frozen hands and face. The room was small but cozy, with a fire crackling in the hearth and a table set with food. It looked like someone had just been there, but the room was empty. I didn't care. I collapsed into a chair by the fire, my whole body shaking with exhaustion. I ate some of the food, not even caring what it was, and drank the water that was set out. The warmth and the food helped clear my head, and I started to feel like myself again. But as I sat there, staring into the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cabin was too perfect, too convenient. It was like it had been waiting for me, and the fact that it was empty with no sign of the owner made me uneasy. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just tired and scared, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I decided to stay the night. I didn't have much of a choice. I was too exhausted to go anywhere, and the thought of going back out into the dark woods was unbearable. I found a bed in the corner of the room, and I lay down, pulling the blankets over me. The bed was soft and warm, and despite my unease, I fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up to the sound of birds chirping. The sun was streaming in through the windows, and the room was filled with light. For a moment, I forgot where I was, and then it all came rushing back. I sat up, looking around the cabin. Everything was just as I had left it. The fire had died down to embers, the food was still on the table. But something felt different. I got up and walked to the door, pushing it open. The woods outside were bright and peaceful, the sunlight filtering through the trees. The trail was there, clear as day, leading back down the ridge. I felt a surge of relief but also confusion. How had I missed it last night? It was right there. I packed up my things and left the cabin, following the trail back down. The hike was easier in the daylight and I made good time. By the time I reached the trailhead, The sun was high in the sky, and I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I was safe, but as I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin. It didn't make sense. Who had left the food and the fire? Why was the door open? And why had the trail been so hard to find in the dark? I didn't have any answers, and I knew I probably never would. But one thing was clear: I had been lucky. Lucky to find the cabin, lucky to make it out of the woods. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. I knew they wouldn't believe me, or they'd think I was exaggerating. But I couldn't forget it. The memory of that night stayed with me, a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, and how easy it is to get lost. I haven't been back to that trail since. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I think about the cabin, and I wonder if it's still there, waiting for the next lost hiker to stumble upon it. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but life kept getting in the way. Today, though, I was determined. The trail was one I'd never done before, a winding path through dense woods that promised a view of the valley below. I packed my bag with the essentials: water, a flashlight, a first aid kit, a map, and some snacks. I didn't plan to be out long, just a few hours, enough to clear my head and get some fresh air. The trailhead was easy to find, marked by a wooden sign that had seen better days. The letters were faded, but I could still make out the name: Black Ridge Trail. The first mile was easy. The path was wide, the ground firm under my boots. The trees were tall and thick, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into a soft, green glow. Birds chirped somewhere above, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. I felt good, strong, the kind of good that makes you forget about the world outside the woods. I checked my watch. It was just past 3 p.m. Plenty of time to make it to the overlook and back before dark. But as I walked, the trail began to change. The wide path narrowed, the trees grew closer together, and the ground became uneven, littered with rocks and roots. I had to watch my step, careful not to twist an ankle. The air felt heavier, too, like the woods were holding their breath. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. I'd been on enough hikes to know that trails could be unpredictable. This was nothing new. By the time I reached the overlook, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. The view was worth it, though. The valley stretched out before me, a sea of green and gold bathed in the fading light. I took a few photos, drank some water, and checked my watch again. 5:30 p.m. I had about an hour of daylight left. Enough time to get back if I hurried. I turned to head back the way I came, but something felt off. The trail didn't look the same. The markers I'd noticed on the way up, a bent tree here, a pile of rocks there, were gone. Or maybe I just couldn't see them in the dim light. I pulled out my map, but it was no help. The trail was too small to be marked in detail. I told myself to stay calm. I'd just follow the path back the way I came. How hard could it be? But the deeper I went into the woods, the more uncertain I became. The trail twisted and turned, splitting off into smaller paths that I didn't remember seeing before. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to grab me. My heart started to race, but I forced myself to keep moving. I had to find my way back before it got too dark. The sun was gone now, and the woods were plunged into twilight. I turned on my flashlight, but the beam was weak, barely cutting through the gloom. The shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting and dancing at the edges of my vision. I tried to focus on the trail, but it was getting harder to see. My boots crunched on leaves and twigs, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. I could hear my own breathing, quick and shallow, and the pounding of my heart in my ears. I don't know how long I walked. Felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. The trail was gone, swallowed up by the darkness. I was lost. Panic set in, cold and sharp, like a knife in my chest. I stopped walking and tried to think. I had to stay calm. I had to figure this out. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, I was in the middle of nowhere. I thought about shouting for help, but who would hear me? The woods were empty, silent except for the rustle of leaves in the wind. I felt a surge of anger at myself. How could I have been so stupid? I should have turned back sooner. I should have paid more attention to the trail. I kept walking, hoping to find something. A road, a cabin, anything. But the woods seemed endless. A maze of trees and shadows that all looked the same. My legs were tired, my feet sore, but I couldn't stop. If I stopped, I might never start again. The flashlight flickered, and I shook it, willing it to stay on. The last thing I needed was to be left in the dark. And then I saw it. A light, small and faint, but definitely there. My heart leapt. I moved toward it, my steps quick and clumsy. The light grew brighter as I got closer, and I realized it was coming from a cabin. A real, honest-to-God cabin in the middle of the woods. I almost cried with relief. I stumbled up to the door and knocked, my hands shaking. There was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I tried the door and it creaked open. The cabin was small, just one room with a fireplace, a table, and a bed. The light was coming from a lantern on the table. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room. It was empty, but there were signs of life. A half-empty bottle of water on the table, a blanket on the bed. Someone had been here recently. I called out, my voice echoing in the small space. No one answered. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or scared. At least I wasn't alone out here. But where was the person who lived here? And why had they left the lantern on? I sat down at the table, my legs giving out beneath me. My mind raced with questions, but I was too tired to think straight. I just needed to rest for a minute. Just a minute. I closed my eyes, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of footsteps outside. My eyes snapped open, and I sat up, my heart pounding. The lantern was still burning, but the light seemed dimmer now. The footsteps were getting closer, crunching on the gravel outside the cabin. I stood up, my legs wobbly, and looked around for something to defend myself with. There was nothing, no knife, no stick, nothing. I backed into a corner, my eyes fixed on the door. It opened slowly, the hinges creaking. A man stepped inside, tall and broad-shouldered, with a beard and a flannel shirt. He looked like a hunter or a lumberjack. He stopped when he saw me, his eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and rough. I stammered, my mouth dry. I got lost. I was hiking and I got lost. I saw your light and He held up a hand, cutting me off. "You shouldn't be out here. Not at night." I nodded, swallowing hard. "I know. I'm sorry. I just need to get back to the trail." He studied me for a moment, then sighed. "You're lucky I found you. These woods, they're not safe after dark." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. "Can you help me? Please?" He nodded. "I'll take you back, but you gotta do exactly what I say. No questions. Understand?" I nodded again, too scared to argue. He turned and walked out of the cabin, and I followed him, my legs trembling. The woods were even darker now, the trees looming like giants in the night. The man moved quickly, his steps sure and confident. I struggled to keep up, my flashlight bouncing in my hand. We walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of our footsteps and the occasional hoot of an owl. I wanted to ask him how far it was, how long it would take, but I didn't dare. He had said no questions, and I wasn't about to test him. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be out there, watching us, waiting. I tried to push them away, but they clung to me like shadows. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it, the trailhead. The wooden sign was just visible in the beam of my flashlight. I almost cried with relief. The man stopped and turned to me. "You're safe now," he said, "but don't come back here. Not at night. Not ever." I nodded, too exhausted to speak. He turned and disappeared into the woods, leaving me standing there, alone. I didn't wait to see if he was really gone. I started walking, my steps quick and frantic, until I reached my car. I got in and locked the doors, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying the night over and over. When I finally got home, I collapsed into bed, too tired to even take off my boots. I slept fitfully, my dreams filled with dark woods and shadowy figures. The next morning, I woke up with a start, the memories of the night before flooding back. I got up and looked out the window, half expecting to see the man standing there, watching me. But the street was empty, just the usual morning traffic. I spent the day trying to make sense of what had happened. I thought about going back to the woods to see if the cabin was really there, if the man was real. But every time I considered it, a cold fear gripped me, and I couldn't bring myself to do it. I never went back to Black Ridge Trail. Couldn't. The memory of that night stayed with me, a dark shadow in the back of my mind. I told myself it was just a bad experience, that I'd been lucky to get out alive. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. Something about those woods, about that man that I couldn't explain. And so I stayed away. I hiked other trails, safer. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been driving for hours, the kind of drive where the road stretches endlessly and the scenery blurs into a monotonous haze. My legs were stiff, my mind restless, and the idea of stretching them on a quiet hike seemed like the perfect way to shake off the fatigue. The trail was one I'd never taken before, marked on an old map I found in the glove compartment. It was supposed to be a short loop, just a couple of miles through the woods, leading to a viewpoint and then back to the parking lot. Easy, simple, nothing I couldn't handle. I parked my car in the empty lot, the gravel crunching under my tires. The air was cool, the kind of cool that makes you feel alive, and the scent of pine trees was sharp and fresh. I grabbed my backpack, double-checked the contents, water, a protein bar, a flashlight, and a pocket knife, and started walking. The trailhead was marked by a wooden sign, the letters faded but still legible. Silver Creek Loop, 2.5 miles. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the path. The first mile was uneventful. The trail was well maintained, the dirt packed firm beneath my boots. The trees were tall and thick, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. Birds chirped somewhere in the distance, and the occasional rustle of leaves made me glance over my shoulder. But it was always just the wind. I felt good, my body warming up to the rhythm of the hike, my mind clearing with each step. But then, something changed. It was subtle at first. The birds stopped singing. The air grew heavier, the kind of heavy that makes your skin prickle. I slowed my pace, scanning the trees around me. Nothing looked out of the ordinary, but the silence was unnerving. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was alone in the woods and my mind was playing tricks on me. I kept walking, but the unease stayed with me, a knot tightening in my stomach. The trail began to narrow, the trees closing in on either side. The ground grew rougher, roots snaking across the path, rocks jutting out at odd angles. I had to watch my step, my boots crunching on twigs and leaves. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees were denser, their trunks twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy now, and the air was damp and cold. I checked my watch. I should have been close to the viewpoint by now, but there was no sign of it. The trail seemed to stretch on endlessly, winding through the trees with no end in sight. I pulled out the map, but it was no help. The trail didn't match the map, the landmarks all wrong. I felt a flicker of panic, but I pushed it down. I wasn't lost, couldn't be lost. I just needed to keep going. The shadows deepened as the sun dipped lower in the sky. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. The trail was barely visible now, the undergrowth thick and tangled. I stumbled over a root, catching myself on a tree trunk. My hand came away sticky with sap, and I wiped it on my pants, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I was sweating despite the cold, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I heard it, a sound, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps, not mine. They were coming from behind me, slow and deliberate. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I turned, sweeping the beam across the trees, but there was nothing there, just darkness. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then they started again, closer this time. I didn't wait to see who or what was following me. I broke into a run, my boots pounding against the dirt. The trail was a blur, the trees a dark wall on either side. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest burning. I didn't look back, didn't dare. The footsteps were still there, keeping pace with me, never falling behind. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, my legs aching, my lungs on fire. The trail twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the forest. The trees were so close now, their branches scraping against my arms, their roots tripping me at every step. I fell, my knees hitting the ground hard, my flashlight skittering out of my hand. I scrambled to my feet, my hands clawing at the dirt, and grabbed the flashlight. The beam flickered, the batteries dying, and I shook it desperately, the light sputtering back to life. The footsteps were closer now, almost on top of me. I could hear breathing, heavy and labored, but it wasn't mine. I ran again, my legs screaming in protest, my mind a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. The trail ended abruptly, the trees opening up into a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a cabin, its windows dark, its door hanging open. I didn't think. I just ran towards it, my feet slipping on the wet grass. The cabin was old, the wood weathered and splintered, the roof sagging in the middle. I stumbled through the door, slamming it shut behind me. The inside was pitch black, the air thick with the smell of mildew and rot. I leaned against the door, my chest heaving, my hands shaking. The footsteps stopped outside. I held my breath, my ears straining for any sound. There was nothing, just silence. I waited, my heart pounding, my body tense. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell. The silence was suffocating, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to see. I had to know. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The cabin was small, just one room with a dirt floor and a fireplace in the corner. There was a table in the center, its surface covered in dust, and a chair lying on its side. The walls were bare, the wood cracked and splintered. There was no one here, no one but me. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, my shoulders sagging with relief. I was safe. I was alone. I walked over to the table, my boots crunching on the dirt floor. There was something on the table, something small and metallic. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. It was a key, old and rusted, the teeth worn down. I didn't have time to wonder what it was for. The door creaked open behind me, the sound sending a jolt of fear through my body. I turned, the flashlight beam swinging towards the door. It was empty, just the darkness outside. But the door was open. I hadn't opened it. I backed away, my heart racing, my hands trembling. The beam of the flashlight flickered again, the batteries dying. I shook it, but the light only grew dimmer. And then I saw it, a shadow moving in the corner of the room. I swung the beam towards it, but there was nothing there. Just the empty corner, the walls bare and cracked. The light went out. I was plunged into darkness, the kind of darkness that feels alive, that presses in on you from all sides. I fumbled with the flashlight, my hands shaking, but it was no use. The batteries were dead. I dropped it, the sound echoing in the silence. I could hear breathing again, heavy and labored, but it wasn't mine. It was close, too close. I backed away, my hands groping in the darkness, until I hit the wall. The breathing was louder now, right in front of me. I could feel it, hot and damp, on my face. I pressed myself against the wall, my body trembling, my mind screaming at me to run, to fight, to do something. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. And then it was gone. The breathing stopped. The presence vanished. The darkness was just darkness again, empty and silent. I stayed there, pressed against the wall, for what felt like an eternity. My heart slowed, my breathing evened out. The fear ebbed away, leaving me exhausted and drained. I don't know how long I stayed in that cabin. Could have been minutes or hours or days. Time didn't seem to matter anymore, but eventually I found the strength to move. I groped my way to the door, my hands shaking, and stepped outside. The clearing was empty, the trees silent and still. The sun was rising, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. I didn't look back. I just started walking, my legs moving on their own. The trail was easier to follow in the daylight, the trees less menacing. I walked for what felt like hours, my mind numb, my body on autopilot. And then, finally, I saw it. The parking lot. My car was still there, the gravel crunching under my boots as I approached. I got in, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, the sound comforting and familiar. I drove away, the trees blurring into a green haze as I sped down the road. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the sun high in the sky, the world bright and normal again. I never went back to that trail. I never told anyone what happened. I couldn't explain it, not even to myself. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the dark The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but work kept getting in the way. Today, I finally had the time. The trail was supposed to be a simple loop, about 6 miles through the woods, with a few steep climbs but nothing too challenging. I had done my research, packed my bag with water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a flashlight just in case. I even checked the weather, clear skies, no rain, perfect conditions. Or so I thought. The trailhead was easy to find, marked by a wooden sign with the name of the trail carved into it. The path was wide and well-trodden, lined with tall trees that filtered the sunlight into golden beams. The air smelled fresh, like pine and earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the gravel and the occasional chirp of birds. I felt good, strong, ready for this. I had hiked before, but never alone. There was something thrilling about being out here by myself, just me and the wilderness. The first mile was easy. The trail wound gently through the forest, and I kept a steady pace, enjoying the solitude. I passed a few other hikers early on, but as I went deeper, the trail grew quieter. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out more and more of the sky. The sunlight dimmed, and the air felt cooler. I checked my watch. It was only 3 p.m., but the woods made it feel much later. By the second mile, the trail began to change. The wide path narrowed, and the ground became rougher, littered with rocks and roots. I had to watch my step more carefully, but I didn't mind. It felt more like a real hike now, more challenging. I stopped to take a sip of water and looked around. The trees were thicker here, their trunks dark and gnarled. The underbrush was dense, with ferns and bushes crowding the edges of the trail. I couldn't see far in any direction, just a wall of green and brown. It was beautiful, but also a little unnerving. I shook off the feeling and kept going. The third mile was where things started to feel off. The trail was still there, but it was harder to follow. The markers, small yellow blazes painted on the trees, were spaced farther apart, and I had to stop a few times to make sure I was still on the right path. The forest seemed quieter too, the birdsong replaced by an eerie silence. I told myself it was just the time of day, that the birds were settling down for the evening. But the silence felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I checked my map. According to it, I should have been coming up on a small stream soon with a wooden bridge to cross. But when I reached the spot where the stream was supposed to be, there was nothing, just more trees and underbrush. I frowned and looked at the map again. Maybe I had missed a turn. I backtracked a little, but I couldn't find any other paths branching off. The trail I was on seemed to be the only one. I decided to keep going. The trail had to lead somewhere, and I didn't want to turn back now. But as I walked, the feeling of unease grew. The trees seemed closer together, their branches twisting and tangling overhead. The light was fading fast, and the shadows were getting longer. I pulled out my flashlight, just in case, but I didn't want to use it yet. I still had plenty of daylight left, or so I thought. By the 4th mile, I was starting to get worried. The trail was almost impossible to follow now, the markers few and far between. The ground was uneven, and I had to climb over fallen logs and push through thick bushes. My legs were tired, and my shirt was soaked with sweat. I stopped to catch my breath and looked around. The forest looked the same in every direction. Trees, bushes, shadows. No sign of the stream, no sign of the bridge, no sign of anything. I pulled out my phone to check my location, but there was no signal. Of course, I should have expected that. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing. I had never been lost before, not like this. I always knew where I was, always had a plan. But now, I was completely disoriented. I didn't even know which way was back. I decided to keep moving. Standing still wasn't going to help. I picked a direction and started walking, hoping I would find something. A trail, a road, anything. But the deeper I went, the more lost I felt. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, endless and unchanging. The light was almost gone now, and the shadows were merging into darkness. I turned on my flashlight, but the beam was weak, barely cutting through the gloom. I don't know how long I walked. Felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. My legs were aching, and my throat was dry. I had finished my water a while ago, and my mouth felt like sandpaper. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan, but there was nothing, just trees and darkness. And then I saw it, a light. At first, I thought I was imagining it, my mind playing tricks on me. But no, there it was, a faint glow in the distance. I almost cried with relief. I stumbled toward it, my legs moving on their own. The light grew brighter as I got closer, and I could see that it was coming from a small cabin. It was old, the wood weathered and gray, but there was smoke coming from the chimney and a warm light spilling from the windows. I didn't even think about who might be inside. I just wanted to get out of the forest. I ran the last few yards and banged on the door. It opened almost immediately, and a man stood there, silhouetted against the light. He was older, with a beard and a flannel shirt. He didn't say anything, just stepped aside and let me in. The cabin was small but cozy, with a fire crackling in the hearth and a pot of something that smelled amazing on the stove. I collapsed into a chair by the fire, my whole body shaking. The man didn't ask any questions, just handed me a cup of water and a blanket. I drank the water in one gulp and wrapped the blanket around myself, trying to stop the shivering. After a while, I felt calm enough to speak. I told the man about the hike, about getting lost, about the trail that seemed to disappear. He listened quietly, nodding now and then. When I finished, he just smiled and said, "You're not the first." He told me that the forest had a way of playing tricks on people, especially those who didn't know it well. The trail I had been on was old and not well maintained, easy to lose if you weren't paying attention. He said he had lived out here for years, and he had seen plenty of hikers get turned around. He offered to let me stay the night and said he would show me the way back to the trailhead in the morning. I didn't argue. I was too tired, too relieved to be out of the forest. The man gave me some stew and a bed by the fire, and I fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, the man was true to his word. He led me through the forest, following a path that I couldn't see, but he seemed to know by heart. It wasn't long before we reached the trailhead, and I could see my car parked in the distance. I thanked the man, but he just nodded and disappeared back into the trees. I drove home that day, my mind still reeling from the experience. I couldn't shake the feeling of how close I had come to being lost forever, but I also felt a strange sense of gratitude. The forest had tested me, pushed me to my limits, but it had also shown me kindness in the form of that old man and his cabin. I haven't been back to that trail since. I don't think I ever will, but I'll never forget it or the lesson it taught me. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also unforgiving. And sometimes, the only way to find your way out is to trust in the kindness of strangers. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but work kept getting in the way. Today, though, I finally had the time. The trail was supposed to be a simple loop, about 5 miles through the woods, with a few steep climbs but nothing too challenging. I had done my research, packed my bag with water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a flashlight just in case. I even checked the weather, clear skies, no chance of rain. I thought I was prepared. I was wrong. The trail started off easy enough. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your nose but feels refreshing in your lungs. The trees were tall and dense, their leaves already turning shades of orange and red. The path was well marked, with bright yellow signs nailed to the trees every so often. I could hear the occasional bird chirping, and the crunch of leaves under my boots was steady and reassuring. For the first hour or so, everything felt perfect. I was alone, but not lonely. The solitude was comforting, like the woods were wrapping me in a quiet embrace. But then, slowly, things started to change. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The birds had stopped chirping. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they had flown off to somewhere warmer as the sun dipped lower. But the absence of sound was unnerving. The woods felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I kept walking, trying to shake off the feeling, but it clung to me like a second skin. The trail began to narrow, the trees closing in on either side. The markers were still there, but they seemed farther apart now, or maybe I was just imagining it. I pulled out my phone to check the map, but there was no signal. I told myself it was fine. I had the trail memorized. Just keep going, I thought. Just keep moving forward. The sun was almost gone now, and the shadows were growing longer. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. The light bounced off the trees, casting strange shapes on the ground. My footsteps sounded louder now, echoing in the silence. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, and the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow maybe, or a fallen branch. But as I got closer, I realized it was something else. A figure standing perfectly still just off the trail. My breath caught in my throat. I stopped walking, my flashlight trained on the spot where I had seen it. But there was nothing there now, just trees and darkness. I told myself it was my imagination. The woods can play tricks on you, especially when you're alone. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I could feel it like eyes on the back of my neck. I turned around, scanning the trees, but there was no one there, just the endless stretch of forest, dark and silent. I started walking again, faster this time. The trail was harder to follow in the dark, and I had to keep my flashlight pointed at the ground to make sure I didn't trip over roots or rocks. My heart was racing, and I could feel the sweat dripping down my back despite the cold. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing, just the trees, the shadows, and the sound of my own footsteps. The trail began to climb, the ground growing steeper and more uneven. My legs were burning, but I didn't dare stop. I had to keep moving. I had to get out of here. The markers were harder to find now, and I started to wonder if I had taken a wrong turn. But no, I couldn't have. I had been following the trail the whole time. Hadn't I? The woods seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around me like a cage. My flashlight flickered, and I shook it, willing it to stay on. The beam grew dimmer, and I realized with a sinking feeling that the batteries were dying. I fumbled in my bag for the spare ones I had packed, but my hands were shaking so badly that I dropped them. They rolled away into the darkness, and I didn't dare go after them. I kept walking, my flashlight growing dimmer with every step. The trail was almost impossible to see now, and I had to rely on memory to guide me. But the woods didn't look familiar anymore. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like claws. The ground was covered in a thick layer of leaves, and I could feel them crunching under my boots with every step. The sound was deafening in the silence. And then I heard it, a sound, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps, not mine. They were coming from behind me, slow and deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see what was there, but I had to. had to know. I turned, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. And there, standing just a few feet away, was the figure I had seen earlier. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes that blended into the shadows. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were fixed on me. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching me. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted down the trail. The trees blurred past me, their branches scratching at my arms and face. I could hear the footsteps behind me, faster now, closing in. I didn't look back, couldn't. I just ran, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The trail twisted and turned, and I followed it blindly, my only thought to get away. But the woods seemed to be working against me. The trees were closer together now, their roots snaking across the path, tripping me at every turn. My flashlight died completely, plunging me into darkness. I stumbled, falling to my knees, the leaves crunching beneath me. I could hear the footsteps right behind me now, so close I could almost feel the man's breath on my neck. I scrambled to my feet, my hands clawing at the ground for something, anything to defend myself. My fingers closed around a rock, and I gripped it tightly, turning to face the man. But there was no one there, just the empty trail, the trees, and the darkness. I stood there, my chest heaving, the rock still clutched in my hand. The woods were silent again, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. I was lost, completely and utterly lost. And then I saw it, a light, faint but steady, through the trees. I didn't stop to think. I ran toward it, my legs moving on their own. The light grew brighter as I got closer, and I realized it was a cabin. A small, wooden cabin with a single window glowing softly in the darkness. I didn't care who lived there or why they were out in the middle of the woods. I just needed to get inside. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me. The cabin was warm, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke. There was a fire crackling in the hearth, and a man sitting in a chair by the fire. He looked up as I entered, his face calm and expressionless. "You're lost," he said, his voice low and steady. I nodded, too out of breath to speak. I could still feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins, my heart pounding in my chest. The man stood up, walking over to me. He was older, with gray hair and a weathered face. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on the rock still clutched in my hand. "You don't need that here," he said, gently prying the rock from my fingers. "You're safe now." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that I was safe, that the man in the woods was gone, that I had made it out. But the fear was still there, lingering in the back of my mind like a shadow. The man led me to a chair by the fire, handing me a blanket and a cup of hot tea. I wrapped the blanket around my shoulders, the warmth seeping into my bones. The tea was strong and bitter, but it helped to steady my nerves. I sat there, staring into the fire, trying to make sense of what had happened. The man didn't ask any questions. He just sat there, watching me with those calm, steady eyes. After a while, he stood up and walked over to the window, pulling the curtains shut. "You should rest," he said. "You've had a long night." I didn't argue. I was exhausted, my body and mind both drained. I lay down on the couch, the blanket still wrapped around me, and closed my eyes. The last thing I remember before falling asleep was the sound of the fire crackling in the hearth and the man's voice, soft and reassuring. "You're safe now." When I woke up, the sun was streaming through the windows. The cabin was empty, the fire reduced to a pile of smoldering embers. I sat up, my body stiff and sore, and looked around. The man was gone, but he had left a note on the table. "The trail is marked. Follow it back to the road. You'll be fine." I folded the note and put it in my pocket, then stepped outside. The woods looked different in the daylight, the trees less menacing, the shadows less deep. The trail was easy to follow, the markers bright and clear. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but work kept getting in the way. Today, though, I finally had the time. The trail was one I hadn't done before, a narrow path that wound through dense woods and up into the hills. It was supposed to be challenging, but rewarding, the kind of hike that makes you feel alive. I packed my bag the night before: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a lightweight jacket. I didn't think I'd need most of it, but it's better to be safe than sorry. I left early, the air still cool, the kind of cool that makes you feel like you're the only person awake in the world. The trailhead was easy to find, marked by a wooden sign that had seen better days. The paint was peeling, and the letters were faded, but I could still make out the name: Black Ridge Trail. I double-checked the map on my phone, even though I had already memorized the route. The trail was a loop about 10 miles in total, with a steep climb in the middle. It was supposed to take around 5 hours, but I figured I could do it in 4 if I kept a good pace. I took a deep breath, adjusted my backpack, and started walking. The first mile was easy. The trail was wide and well-maintained, the kind of path that makes you feel like you're just out for a stroll. The trees were tall and thick, their leaves filtering the sunlight into a soft, green glow. Birds chirped somewhere overhead, and the air smelled like pine and earth. I felt good, strong. I kept a steady pace, my boots crunching on the gravel. I passed a couple of other hikers early on, but after the first mile, I didn't see anyone else. It was just me and the woods. The trail started to climb around the second mile. The trees grew closer together, their branches reaching out like they were trying to touch each other. The path narrowed, and the ground became rougher, littered with rocks and roots. I had to watch my step, but I didn't mind. It felt good to work a little, to feel my muscles straining as I climbed. The air was still cool, but I could feel sweat starting to form on my back. I stopped for a moment to take a drink of water and check my phone. No signal, but I wasn't surprised. I was deep in the woods now. I kept going, the trail winding higher and higher. The trees thinned out a bit, and I could see glimpses of the sky through the branches. The sun was higher now, but the woods still felt dark, like the light couldn't quite penetrate the canopy. I started to notice little things. A broken branch here, a scuff mark on a rock there, signs that other people had been here before me. It was comforting in a way. I wasn't the first person to take this trail, and I wouldn't be the last. Around the third mile, the trail started to get steeper. The rocks were bigger now, and I had to use my hands to climb over them. My breathing was heavier, and my legs were starting to ache, but I pushed through. I was determined to make it to the top. The trees were thinner here, and I could see patches of sky. The sun was bright, but the air was still cool. I stopped again to catch my breath and take another drink of water. I checked my phone again, still no signal. I wasn't worried, though. I had plenty of water, and I knew the trail. I'd be fine. The fourth mile was the hardest. The trail was almost vertical in places, and the rocks were loose. I had to be careful where I put my feet, and my hands were starting to hurt from gripping the rocks. My backpack felt heavier now, like it was pulling me down. I thought about stopping, about turning back, but I didn't. I was too close to the top. I could feel it. The trees were almost gone now, replaced by scrubby bushes and patches of grass. The wind was stronger up here, and it felt good on my face. I kept climbing one step at a time. Finally, I reached the top. The view was incredible. I could see for miles, rolling hills, dense forests, and in the distance, the faint outline of the town I had left that morning. The sky was a deep, clear blue, and the sun was warm on my face. I sat down on a rock and took a long drink of water. I felt proud of myself, like I had accomplished something. I took a few pictures with my phone, even though I knew they wouldn't do the view justice. I sat there for a while, just enjoying the moment. It was peaceful, quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. But then, something changed. I don't know how to describe it, but the air felt different, heavier. The wind died down, and the birds stopped singing. It was like the woods were holding their breath. I stood up, suddenly uneasy. I looked around, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Just the same rocks, the same bushes, the same view. but something felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination. I was alone up here, miles from anyone else. There was no one to watch me, but the feeling didn't go away. It got stronger. I started to feel like I needed to leave, like I shouldn't be here. I packed up my things quickly and started back down the trail. The descent was harder than the climb. The rocks were slippery, and my legs were tired. I had to go slow, careful not to lose my footing. The woods felt darker now, even though the sun was still high in the sky. The trees seemed closer together, their branches reaching out like they were trying to grab me. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I didn't see anything. Around the 5th mile, I heard something. It was faint, but it was there, a rustling in the bushes. I stopped, my heart pounding. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or a rabbit. But the sound didn't stop. It got louder, closer. I could hear twigs snapping, leaves crunching. I started walking faster, my eyes darting around. I didn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was following me. I tried to stay calm, to tell myself it was just my imagination. But the sound kept getting closer. I could hear it now, just behind me. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I turned around, and there it was. A man. He was tall, with dark hair and a beard. He was wearing a green jacket and jeans, and he had a backpack slung over one shoulder. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching me. But there was something about him, something that made my skin crawl. His eyes were cold, empty, like he wasn't really seeing me. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't run, the trail was too steep, too rocky. I couldn't fight. I didn't have anything to defend myself with. I just stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The man didn't move. He just kept staring at me, his eyes boring into mine. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the air was being sucked out of my lungs. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My voice was stuck in my throat. Finally, the man moved. He took a step forward, then another. I backed up, my feet stumbling over the rocks. He didn't say anything, just kept coming closer. I turned and started running, my feet slipping on the loose rocks. I didn't care about falling, about getting hurt. I just had to get away. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy on the trail. I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart pounding in my ears. The trail seemed to go on forever. My legs were burning, my lungs were on fire, but I didn't stop. I could still hear him behind me, his footsteps getting closer. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew I couldn't let him catch me. I pushed myself harder, my feet pounding on the trail. The trees were a blur, the rocks a hazard I barely noticed. All I could think about was getting away. Finally, I saw the trailhead. The wooden sign was a welcome sight, but I didn't stop. I kept running, my legs screaming in protest. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I threw myself inside and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, my heart racing, my breath coming in gasps. I looked around, but I didn't see the man. He was gone. I didn't wait. I started the car and drove away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't look back. I just kept driving, my mind racing. Who was that man? What did he want? Why was he following me? I didn't have any answers, and I didn't want to think about it. I just wanted to get home. When I finally got back to my apartment, I locked the door behind me and sat down on the couch. I was still shaking, my heart still pounding. I couldn't stop thinking about the man, about the way he had looked at me. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? What would I even say? I didn't have any proof, any evidence, just a feeling. But it was a feeling I couldn't shake. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself. I turned on the TV, but I couldn't focus. I tried to read, but the words just blurred together. I kept thinking about the man, about the way he had followed me. I couldn't get his face out of my mind. Those cold, empty eyes. I felt like I was going crazy. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. I heard his footsteps, felt his eyes on me. I tossed and turned, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was losing my mind. The sun was already dipping low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but life kept getting in the way. Now, with a free afternoon and a restless mind, I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with the essentials: water, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and some snacks, and headed out. The trail was one I'd done before years ago, but I remembered it being straightforward. A loop that would take me through the woods, up a ridge, and back down to the parking lot before dark. Or so I thought. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your nose and makes your breath visible. I zipped up my jacket and adjusted my backpack, feeling the weight of the water bottles shift as I started walking. The trail was easy at first, well-marked and wide enough for two people to walk side by side. The trees were tall and bare, their branches clawing at the gray sky. The ground was a mix of frozen dirt and patches of snow, crunching under my boots with every step. I could hear the occasional bird call, but otherwise the woods were quiet. Too quiet. I kept a steady pace, my eyes scanning the trail ahead. The map I'd glanced at earlier said the loop was about 6 miles, but I wasn't sure how accurate that was. Time seemed to stretch out in the woods, minutes feeling like hours. I checked my watch. It was already 3:30 p.m. The sun would be down by 5 o'clock, and I didn't want to be caught out here in the dark. I picked up my pace, my breath coming out in short puffs as I climbed the gradual incline. The trail began to narrow, the trees closing in on either side. The markers, bright yellow rectangles nailed to the trunks, were still visible, but they seemed farther apart now. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking it. But the deeper I went, the more the woods seemed to change. The ground became uneven, roots jutting out like bony fingers waiting to trip me. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the trees were sucking the warmth right out of me. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath and take a sip of water. My throat was dry, and my legs were starting to ache. I looked around, trying to orient myself. The trail was supposed to curve to the left, but the path ahead seemed to fork in 2 directions. Neither looked familiar. I pulled out my phone, hoping to check the map, but there was no signal. Of course. I cursed under my breath and shoved the phone back into my pocket. I decided to take the left fork, reasoning that it looked more worn. The right path was overgrown, barely visible under the layer of dead leaves and snow. The left trail at least had some footprints. I followed them, my boots sinking into the soft ground. The trees here were denser, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that blocked out most of the fading light. It felt like walking through a tunnel, the walls closing in with every step. The trail began to slope upward, the incline steeper than before. My thighs burned as I climbed, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, despite the cold. I stopped again, leaning against a tree to rest. My heart was pounding, and my head felt light. I took another sip of water, but it didn't help. Something felt off. The woods were too quiet, too still. Even the birds had stopped calling. I pushed myself off the tree and kept going, my eyes fixed on the ground in front of me. The trail was getting harder to follow, the markers fewer and farther between. I started to doubt my decision to take the left fork. Maybe I should have gone right. Maybe I was going in circles. I tried to shake the thought, but it clung to me like a burr. The sun was almost gone now, the sky a deep shade of orange fading into purple. I pulled out my flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting through the growing darkness. The trail was barely visible now, just a faint line of disturbed leaves and dirt. I kept walking, my steps quick and uneven. My mind was racing, thoughts tumbling over each other. What if I was lost? What if I had to spend the night out here? I didn't have a tent or a sleeping bag, just a thin jacket and a half-empty water bottle. The trail suddenly opened up into a small clearing. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. In the center of the clearing was a tree, its trunk twisted and gnarled, its branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The ground around it was bare, the snow melted away to reveal blackened earth. It looked like something out of a nightmare, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't want to go near it, but the trail led right past it. I had no choice. I stepped into the clearing, my boots crunching on the frozen ground. The air felt colder here, almost icy. I could see my breath swirling in front of me, the flashlight beam catching the tiny crystals. I kept my eyes on the trail, trying not to look at the tree, but I could feel it, like it was watching me. My skin prickled, and I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. As I passed the tree, I heard a sound, a low, guttural growl, like an animal but deeper, more menacing. I froze, my flashlight beam darting around the clearing. The sound came again, closer this time. I could feel the vibrations in the ground, the air thick with tension. My hands were shaking, the flashlight beam wavering as I tried to steady it. I didn't want to see what was making that sound, but I couldn't help it. I turned the beam toward the tree. There, in the shadows, was a pair of eyes, glowing yellow, like embers in the dark. They were too high off the ground to be a dog or a coyote, too big. I took a step back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The eyes moved, the creature stepping into the light. It was a bear, but not like any bear I'd ever seen. Its fur was matted and patchy, its body thin and bony. It looked sick or maybe starving, and it was looking right at me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The bear growled again, a deep, rumbling sound that made my stomach drop. It took a step toward me, its massive paws crunching on the frozen ground. I could see its teeth, yellow and sharp, glinting in the flashlight beam. My mind was screaming at me to run, but I knew that would only make it worse. Bears could run faster than humans, and this one looked desperate. The bear took another step, its eyes never leaving mine. I could smell it now, a musky, sour stench that made my stomach churn. My legs were shaking, my hands gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles were white. I thought about the bear spray in my backpack, but it was too late to reach for it. The bear was too close. And then, just as I thought it was going to charge, it stopped. Its head tilted, like it was listening to something. I didn't hear anything, but the bear did. It let out a low growl, then turned and lumbered back into the shadows, disappearing into the trees. I stood there, frozen, until I was sure it was gone. Then I turned and ran. I didn't stop running until I was out of the clearing, my lungs burning and my legs aching. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just wanted to get out of the woods. I stumbled through the trees, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I ran. Branches scratched at my face and arms, but I didn't care. I could still hear the bear's growl in my head, still see those glowing eyes. Finally, I burst out of the trees and into the parking lot. My car was the only one there, its dark shape a welcome sight. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I threw my backpack into the passenger seat and climbed in, slamming the door shut behind me. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Then I started the car and drove away, not looking back. It wasn't until I was on the main road that I realized I was crying. Tears streamed down my face, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my fingers hurt. I didn't know if it was relief or fear or just the adrenaline wearing off, but I couldn't stop. I kept driving, the woods fading into the distance behind me. When I got home, I locked the door and sat on the couch, still shaking. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat there in the dark, replaying the scene in my head. The tree, the clearing, the bear. Felt like a nightmare, but I knew it was real. I could still smell the musky stench, still feel the cold air on my skin. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing yellow eyes. I heard the growl, felt the ground shake under the bear's weight. I knew I was lucky to have gotten out alive, but it didn't feel like luck. Felt like a warning. The next morning, I called the park ranger and told them what had happened. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. The bear was gone, back into the woods where it belonged, and I was never going back there again. I still think about that day sometimes, about how close I came to something I couldn't understand, about how the woods can change, how they can turn from familiar to foreign in the blink of an eye. I don't hike anymore. I don't even like being outside after dark, because I know what's out there, waiting in the shadows, and I know how lucky I am to have escaped. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but life kept getting in the way. Today, though, I finally had the time. The trail was one I hadn't done before, marked as moderate on the map, but I wasn't worried. I'd done harder hikes before. I had my backpack with me, water, snacks, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a small knife just in case. I wasn't expecting trouble, but you never know. The woods can be unpredictable. The trail started off easy enough. It was wide and well-marked, with clear signs pointing the way. The trees were tall and thick, their leaves blocking out most of the sunlight. It was quiet, too. No birds, no rustling of animals in the underbrush. Just the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt path. I didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes nature just gets quiet. I walked for about an hour, maybe more. The trail began to narrow, and the markers became harder to spot. I had to stop a few times to make sure I was still going the right way. The map said there should be a creek up ahead, and then the trail would loop back around. But the creek never came. Instead, the path just kept going deeper and deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches twisting together like they were trying to block out the sky. The air felt heavier, too, like it was pressing down on me. I started to feel uneasy. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the quiet get to me. But the further I went, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The trail was supposed to be popular, but I hadn't seen a single person since I started. No footprints, no trash, nothing. It was like I was the only one who had ever been here. I stopped to check my phone, but there was no signal. Not even a single bar. I tried to remember if I had seen any signs warning about dead zones, but I couldn't recall. I pulled out my map again, but it didn't seem to match what I was seeing. The trail I was on wasn't marked, and the landmarks didn't line up. I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere, but I couldn't figure out where. I decided to keep going. Turning back didn't feel like an option. The sun was getting lower, and I didn't want to be stuck out here in the dark. I told myself that if I just kept moving, I'd eventually find the creek or the loop that would take me back to the start. But the trail kept getting narrower and harder to follow. The trees were so close together now that I had to squeeze between them in some places. The ground was uneven, too, with roots and rocks sticking up everywhere. I tripped more than once, scraping my hands and knees. The light was fading fast. I pulled out my flashlight, but the beam didn't reach very far. It just made the shadows around me seem darker. I could hear my own breathing, loud and uneven. My heart was pounding, and I could feel sweat running down my back, even though the air was cool. I kept telling myself to stay calm, that I just needed to focus and keep moving. But the deeper I went, the more I felt like the woods were closing in on me. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or maybe a trick of the light. But as I got closer, I realized it was a cabin. It was small and old, with wooden walls that looked like they were rotting away. The roof was sagging and the windows were broken. There was no door, just a dark opening where it should have been. I stopped dead in my tracks, my flashlight beam shaking as I held it up to the cabin. I didn't want to go near it. Everything about it felt wrong, but I didn't have a choice. The trail had disappeared completely, and the woods around me were too thick to push through. The cabin was the only way forward. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air was damp and smelled like mold. The floor creaked under my weight, and I could see holes where the wood had rotted through. There was a table in the middle of the room, covered in dust and debris. A chair was tipped over next to it like someone had left in a hurry. I swept my flashlight around the room, but there wasn't much else to see. Just empty walls and a staircase leading up to a second floor. I didn't want to go up there, but I didn't want to stay down here either. The cabin felt like a trap, like it was waiting for something. I forced myself to move, my boots thudding on the stairs as I climbed. Each step felt like it was going to give way under me, but somehow they held. The second floor was even worse. There were 2 rooms, both empty except for a broken bed frame in one and a pile of old clothes in the other. The walls were covered in graffiti, but it was too faded to read. The air was colder up here, and I could feel it seeping into my bones. I wanted to leave, but I didn't know where to go. The woods outside were too dark, too thick. I was trapped. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall, and tried to think. I needed a plan. I couldn't stay here all night, but I couldn't go back out into the woods either. I was lost, and I didn't know what to do. My flashlight was starting to dim, the battery running low. I turned it off to save what little power was left, and the darkness closed in around me. I don't know how long I sat there. Felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. My mind was racing, going over every possible option, but none of them seemed good. I was starting to think I was going to die here, alone in this cabin, when I heard it. A sound. Outside. It was faint, but it was there. A rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I held my breath, listening. The sound got closer, and then I heard footsteps. Someone or something was out there. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to call out, to see if it was someone who could help me. But what if it wasn't? What if it was something else? I stayed silent, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard them again, closer this time. They were coming toward the cabin. I scrambled to my feet, my flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I wasn't going to just sit there and wait. The footsteps reached the door, and I could see a shadow moving in the opening. I tightened my grip on the knife, ready to fight if I had to. Then the shadow stepped inside. It was a man. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and a flannel shirt. He had a backpack on and a rifle slung over his shoulder. He looked as surprised to see me as I was to see him. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us saying a word. Finally, he broke the silence. "You lost." I nodded, my voice catching in my throat. "Yeah, I think I took a wrong turn." He nodded like he understood. "Happens all the time. This trail's not marked well. You're lucky I found you. It's easy to get turned around out here." I didn't feel lucky. I felt like I was about to pass out from relief. He told me his name was Tom and that he was a park ranger. He'd been out checking the trails when he saw my flashlight beam. He offered to take me back to the main trail, and I didn't argue. We walked in silence for a while, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The woods didn't seem as scary with him there, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following us. But there was nothing, just the trees and the shadows. It took us about an hour to reach the main trail. By then, the sun had completely set, and the stars were out. Tom led me to his truck, parked at the trailhead, and offered to drive me back to my car. I didn't argue. I was too tired to think straight. As we drove, I asked him about the cabin. He frowned, like he didn't want to talk about it. "That place has been there for years," he said finally. "No one knows who built it. Some people say it's cursed, but I don't believe in that stuff. It's just an old cabin. Nothing more." I didn't tell him how it had felt inside, how the air had seemed to press down on me, how the shadows had seemed to move. I didn't think he'd believe me. Maybe I didn't believe it myself. He dropped me off at my car, and I thanked him again. He just nodded like it was no big deal. "Be careful out there," he said before driving off. "The woods can be dangerous if you're not prepared." I got in my car and sat there for a while, just staring at the steering wheel. My hands were still shaking, and my clothes were damp with sweat. I felt like I had just woken up from a nightmare, but I was safe now. I was out of the woods. I started the car and drove home, the events of the day replaying in my mind. I didn't know if I'd ever go hiking again, but if I did, I'd make sure to stick to the main trails. And I'd never go alone. The cabin was still out there, though. I could still see it in my mind, its broken windows and sagging roof. I didn't know if it was cursed or just old and abandoned, but I knew one thing for sure. I never wanted to see it again. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but work and life kept getting in the way. Today, I finally had the time. The trail was one I had never taken before, a narrow path that wound through dense woods and up into the hills. It was supposed to be a challenging hike, but I was in good shape, and I liked the idea of pushing myself. I packed my bag with the essentials: water, a few energy bars, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a lightweight rain jacket. The weather forecast had said clear skies, but you can never be too careful in the mountains. I parked my car at the trailhead and double-checked my gear. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine trees filled my lungs as I took my first steps onto the trail. The path was well-marked, with yellow blazes painted on the trees every so often to guide hikers. The first mile was easy, a gentle incline through a thick forest. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional squirrel darted across the path. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. But as I climbed higher, the trail began to change. The trees grew thicker, their branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air felt heavier, damp and cool, and the sounds of birds and squirrels faded away. The only noise was the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I checked my watch. It was only mid-afternoon, but the woods were so dark it felt like dusk. I kept walking, telling myself that the trail would open up soon, but it didn't. Instead, it seemed to close in around me. The trees were so close together that I had to turn sideways to squeeze through some spots. The ground was uneven, littered with rocks and roots that threatened to trip me with every step. My legs were starting to ache, and my breath came in short, shallow gasps. I told myself to keep going, that I would reach the summit soon and the view would be worth it. But then I noticed something strange. The yellow blazes on the trees were gone. I stopped and looked around, trying to spot one, but there was nothing. Just trees, endless trees, all looking the same. My heart started to pound. I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. I pulled out my map and tried to orient myself, but the dense canopy made it impossible to see the sun, and I had no idea which direction I was facing. I decided to retrace my steps, but after walking for what felt like an hour, I realized I was going in circles. The same fallen log, the same cluster of rocks. I had passed them before. Panic started to set in. I was lost, and I had no idea how to get back to the trail. My water was running low, and I had eaten my last energy bar hours ago. My legs were trembling with exhaustion, and my head felt foggy. I knew I needed to stay calm, but it was hard. The woods were so quiet, so still, like they were holding their breath. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made me jump. I kept telling myself that there was nothing to be afraid of, that I was just imagining things, but the fear was there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I decided to keep moving, hoping I would find something. A road, a cabin, anything. But the deeper I went, the more the woods seemed to resist me. The ground was slick with moss, and I slipped more than once, scraping my hands and knees. My clothes were damp with sweat, and my throat was so dry it hurt to swallow. I tried to ration my water, but I couldn't help taking small sips every few minutes, just to keep going. Hours passed. The light faded, and the woods grew darker. I turned on my flashlight, but the beam was weak, barely cutting through the thick shadows. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and every step was a struggle. I was so tired, so hungry, so thirsty. I wanted to sit down to rest, but I knew if I stopped, I might not get up again. And then I saw it, a light, faint but steady, through the trees. My heart leapt. I stumbled toward it, my legs shaking with every step. The light grew brighter, and soon I could see the outline of a cabin. Relief flooded through me. I wasn't saved yet, but at least I wasn't alone. I reached the cabin and knocked on the door. There was no answer. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was small, just one room with a wood stove, a table, and a cot in the corner. There was no one there, but the stove was still warm, and a pot of water was sitting on top, steaming slightly. Someone had been here recently. I didn't care who it was or where they had gone. I just needed to rest. I sat down on the cot and drank the water, which was still warm. Tasted like metal, but I didn't care. I drank it all, then lay down on the cot and closed my eyes. I was so tired, so relieved to be out of the woods. I fell asleep almost instantly. When I woke up, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and the cabin was warm and quiet. I sat up and looked around. The pot of water was gone, and the stove was cold. There was no sign that anyone had been here. I wondered if I had imagined it all, if the cabin had been some kind of mirage. But it was real. I was here and I was alive. I stood up and stretched, my muscles stiff and sore. I knew I needed to find my way back to the trail, but I wasn't as afraid as I had been the night before. The cabin had given me hope. I stepped outside and looked around. The woods were still dense, but the sunlight made them feel less oppressive. I decided to follow the path that led away from the cabin, hoping it would take me back to the trail. It did. After about an hour of walking, I saw a yellow blaze on a tree. I almost cried with relief. I was back on the trail. I followed the blazes, my steps quick and sure now that I knew where I was going. The woods began to thin, and soon I could see the trailhead in the distance. My car was still there, just where I had left it. I got in and drove home, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I got there, I took a long, hot shower and ate a real meal for the first time in what felt like days. I thought about the cabin, about how I had found it just when I needed it most. I didn't know who had built it or who had been there, but I was grateful. It had saved my life. I never went back to that trail. I told myself it was because it was too dangerous, but the truth was I was afraid. Afraid of the woods, of the darkness, of the silence. Afraid of getting lost again. But I also knew that I had survived. I had made it through something that could have killed me, and that knowledge stayed with me, a quiet strength that I carried with me every day. The cabin was still out there, hidden in the woods. I didn't know if I would ever see it again, but I didn't need to. It had done its job. It had brought me back to the world, back to the light. And for that, I would always be grateful. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but work kept getting in the way. Today, though, I finally had the time. The trail was supposed to be a simple loop, something I could finish before dark. I had my backpack with me, water, a few snacks, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I thought I was prepared. I didn't know how wrong I was. The trail started off easy enough. It was well marked, with clear signs pointing the way. The trees were tall and thick, their leaves blocking out most of the sunlight. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional chirp of a bird. I felt good, like I was finally getting away from everything. No emails, no deadlines, no noise, just me and the woods. But as I walked deeper into the forest, things started to feel off. The trail seemed to narrow, the trees closing in around me. The signs became fewer and farther between. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking it. But the further I went, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I checked my phone for the map, but there was no signal. No bars, no Wi-Fi, nothing. I tried to remember the trail map I had looked at before starting, but the details were fuzzy. I knew the loop was supposed to take about 3 hours, but I had been walking for what felt like twice that long. The sun was sinking lower, and the shadows were growing longer. I picked up my pace, trying to stay calm. The trail started to climb, the ground becoming steeper and more uneven. My legs were burning, and my breath was coming in short gasps. I stopped for a moment to drink some water and catch my breath. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, but it grew louder. It was a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The sound was too deep, too menacing. I slowly turned around, scanning the trees for any movement. First, I saw nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something moving. It was big, much bigger than a deer, and it was coming toward me. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the dirt path. The growling grew louder, closer. I could hear the sound of heavy footsteps behind me, snapping twigs and crushing leaves. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The trail twisted and turned, and I followed it blindly, hoping it would lead me to safety. But the forest seemed to go on forever, the trees all looking the same. I was completely lost. The growling was right behind me now, so close I could almost feel the hot breath on my neck. I pushed myself harder, my vision blurring as I ran. And then suddenly the trail ended. I skidded to a stop, my heart sinking as I realized I was standing on the edge of a steep cliff. Below me was a sheer drop at least 100 feet down. I turned around, my back pressed against the edge, and saw it for the first time. It was a bear, a massive, black bear, its eyes locked on me. Its lips were pulled back in a snarl, revealing sharp, yellow teeth. Saliva dripped from its mouth, and its chest heaved with each breath. It was close, too close. I could see the muscles rippling under its fur as it took a step toward me. I had nowhere to go. The cliff was behind me, the bear in front of me. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. I remembered something I had read once. If you're ever face to face with a bear, don't run. Stand your ground, make yourself look bigger, and try to scare it off. But as I stood there, staring into the bear's eyes, I knew I didn't have the courage to do that. I was frozen in fear, my body refusing to move. The bear took another step forward, its growl growing louder. I could see the hunger in its eyes, the way it was sizing me up. I knew I was no match for it. I was going to die here, alone in the woods, with no one to even know what had happened to me. But then, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to just stand there and let this happen. I wasn't going to die without a fight. I reached into my backpack, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the flashlight. I pulled it out and turned it on, shining the bright beam directly into the bear's eyes. The bear roared, a sound so loud it made my ears ring. It stumbled back, shaking its head as if trying to get rid of the light. I kept the beam focused on its eyes, my hands steady despite the fear coursing through me. The bear took another step back, then another. It was working. I didn't waste any time. I turned and ran along the edge of the cliff, looking for a way down. I knew I couldn't go back the way I came. The bear was still there, and it would only be a matter of time before it recovered. I had to find another way. I spotted a narrow path leading down the side of the cliff. It was steep and covered in loose rocks, but it was my only chance. I started down it, my feet slipping on the uneven surface. I could hear the bear behind me, its growls growing fainter as I descended. But I didn't stop. I kept going, my hands gripping the rocks for support as I made my way down. The sun had set by the time I reached the bottom. The forest was dark, the only light coming from the moon above. I was exhausted, my legs shaking from the effort, but I knew I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving to put as much distance between me and the bear as possible. I walked for what felt like hours, my flashlight guiding the way. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of my boots on the ground. I was cold, my clothes damp with sweat, but I didn't dare stop to rest. I had no idea where I was, or if I was even going in the right direction. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. Finally, I saw a light in the distance. It was faint, but it was there. I quickened my pace, my heart lifting as I realized it was a cabin. I ran toward it, my legs screaming in protest, but I didn't care. I was so close. I reached the cabin and pounded on the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The door opened, and a man stood there, his face filled with concern. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. I just stood there, shaking, as he helped me inside. The man gave me water and a blanket, and I sat by the fire trying to warm up. He listened as I told him what had happened, his expression growing more serious with each word. When I finished, he nodded and told me I was lucky to be alive. The next morning, the man drove me back to the trailhead. My car was still there, just as I had left it. I thanked him, my voice trembling with gratitude. He just nodded and told me to be more careful next time. As I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I had been so close to death, so close to never seeing my family again. But I had made it. I had survived. I didn't go hiking again for a long time after that. And when I finally did, I made sure to stick to well-traveled trails, to always let someone know where I was going, and to never, ever go alone. Because I knew how quickly things could go wrong, how easy it was to get lost in the woods. And I knew that next time, I might not be so lucky. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but work kept getting in the way. Today, I finally had the time. The trail was supposed to be a simple loop, about 6 miles through the woods, with a few steep climbs but nothing too challenging. I had done my research, packed my bag with water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a flashlight just in case. I even checked the weather, clear skies, no chance of rain. I was ready. The trailhead was easy to find, marked by a wooden sign with the name of the trail carved into it. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your nose but feels refreshing in your lungs. The trees were tall, their branches bare, letting the last of the sunlight filter through in golden streaks. The ground was covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves, crunching under my boots with every step. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. I liked that. The first mile was easy. The trail was well marked, with bright orange blazes painted on the trees every so often to keep hikers on the right path. I kept a steady pace, my breath visible in the cold air. The forest was beautiful, peaceful. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves as a squirrel darted across the trail, or the distant call of a bird. It was exactly what I needed. A break from the noise of the city, a chance to clear my head. But as I got deeper into the woods, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The trail seemed narrower than I remembered from the map, the trees closer together. The orange blazes were still there, but they felt farther apart, like the forest was stretching out, trying to swallow the path. I shook the feeling off. I was just being paranoid. The woods can do that to you, make you feel small and exposed, even when you're perfectly safe. By the time I reached the halfway point, the sun was almost gone. The sky was a deep orange, fading into purple at the edges. I knew I should have started earlier, but I had been so eager to get out here that I hadn't thought about the time. I pulled out my flashlight, just in case, and kept walking. The trail started to climb, the ground getting steeper, the rocks slick with moss. My legs were starting to ache, but I pushed through. I was determined to finish the loop. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, whistling through the trees. But then it came again, louder this time. A low, guttural growl, like the sound a dog makes when it's warning you to stay away. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I scanned the trees, but I couldn't see anything. The forest was too dark now, the shadows too deep. I told myself it was nothing, just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound came again, closer this time, and I knew it wasn't a deer. I started walking faster, my boots slipping on the wet leaves. The growl followed me, keeping pace. I could hear it moving through the underbrush, snapping twigs, rustling leaves. My mind raced. Was it a bear? A mountain lion? I didn't know what lived in these woods, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I gripped my flashlight tighter, ready to use it as a weapon if I had to. The trail twisted and turned, the trees closing in around me. I was running now, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. The growl was right behind me, so close I could almost feel it breathing down my neck. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, my legs burning, my chest on fire. The flashlight beam bounced wildly, illuminating the trail in brief, frantic bursts. I could see the orange blazes on the trees, but they were blurry, like my eyes couldn't focus. And then suddenly the trail ended. I skidded to a stop, my boots sliding on the loose dirt. The ground dropped away in front of me, a steep cliff that seemed to go on forever. I stumbled back, my heart in my throat. The growl was right behind me now, so loud it vibrated in my chest. I turned, shining the flashlight into the trees, and that's when I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, low to the ground, reflecting the light like a cat's. They were too far apart to be a dog's, too big to be a raccoon's. I couldn't see the rest of it, just the eyes, staring at me, unblinking. My mind went blank, all my thoughts replaced by a single primal instinct. Run. I turned and ran along the edge of the cliff, my feet slipping on the loose rocks. The growl followed me, the eyes keeping pace. I could hear it getting closer, the sound of its paws hitting the ground, the snap of its jaws. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just knew I had to get away. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run anymore, I saw it. A narrow path, barely visible in the dark, leading down the side of the cliff. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I took it, scrambling down the steep slope, my hands scraping against the rocks. The growl was right behind me, so close I could feel its breath on my back. I slipped, my feet going out from under me, and I tumbled down the slope, hitting the ground hard. I lay there for a moment, dazed, my body aching. The growl was gone, the forest silent. I sat up slowly, my head spinning. The flashlight was still in my hand, the beam shining weakly on the ground. I looked around, trying to figure out where I was. The cliff was above me, the trail somewhere up there. I was in a small clearing, the ground covered in leaves and fallen branches. And then I saw it, a cabin. It was small, old, the wood weathered and gray. The windows were dark, the door hanging open on its hinges. It looked abandoned, like no one had been here in years. But there was smoke coming from the chimney, thin and wispy, barely visible in the dark. I didn't know what to do. My instincts told me to stay away, to keep running. But I was exhausted, my legs shaking, my body bruised and scraped. I didn't think I could run anymore. I stood up slowly, my legs wobbling beneath me. The cabin was only a few yards away, but it felt like miles. I took a step forward, then another, my eyes fixed on the door. The growl was gone, but I could still feel it, like it was watching me, waiting. I reached the door and hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. I didn't know what was inside, but I didn't have a choice. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was small, just one room with a fireplace, a table, and a bed. The fire was burning low, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. There was a pot hanging over the fire, something bubbling inside. The air smelled like wood smoke and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I closed the door behind me, my back against the wood, and let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. And then I saw him. He was sitting in a chair by the fire, his back to me. He was old, his hair gray and thin, his shoulders hunched. He didn't move, didn't turn around. I didn't know what to do. My heart was still pounding, my hands shaking. I wanted to say something, to ask for help, but the words stuck in my throat. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, gravelly, like he hadn't used it in years. "You shouldn't be here." I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, frozen, my eyes fixed on his back. He didn't turn around, didn't move. The fire crackled in the silence, the only sound in the room. "You shouldn't be here," he said again, his voice louder this time. "It's not safe." I found my voice, barely a whisper. I got lost. There was something out there. I heard it. I saw it. He didn't say anything for a long time. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Finally, he stood up, slowly, his joints creaking. He turned to face me, and I saw his eyes for the first time. They were pale, almost colorless, like the eyes of a blind man. But they were focused on me, sharp and piercing. "You saw it," he said, his voice flat. "The beast." I nodded, my throat dry. What is it?" He didn't answer right away. He turned back to the fire, staring into the flames. "It's been here for as long as I can remember. Longer. It's not an animal, not like the ones you know. It's something else. Something old." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was saying. It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. Why hasn't anyone done anything about it? I asked, my voice trembling. He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. What can anyone do? It's not something you can kill. It's not something you can trap. It's part of the forest. It's always been here. I felt a chill run down my spine. But what does it want? He turned to look at me again, his eyes boring into mine. It wants to survive, like any living thing, and it will do whatever it takes to survive. I didn't know what to say. I felt like I was in a nightmare, like none of this could be real, but it was. The cabin, the fire, the old man. I had been planning this hike for weeks, a solo trip into the mountains, away from everything, work, emails, the noise of everyday life, just me and the trail. I picked a route that wasn't too popular, something off the beaten path but still manageable. The kind of place where you might see a few hikers in a day, but not enough to feel crowded. It was supposed to be peaceful. The drive up was uneventful, just long stretches of road winding through the forest. The last town I passed was about an hour back, a tiny place with one gas station and a diner that looked like it hadn't changed in 50 years. After that, nothing but trees. I pulled into the small dirt parking lot at the trailhead, where only one other car was parked. It was an old, beat-up sedan, probably belonging to someone who had started their hike earlier in the day. The air was crisp when I stepped out of my car. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows. I double-checked my gear, backpack, water, food, flashlight, knife. I had everything I needed for an overnight stay. The plan was simple. Hike up to a ridge where I had marked a good campsite, spend the night, then come back down in the morning. Nothing too extreme. The first few miles were easy. The trail was narrow but well-worn, winding through thick trees and occasional clearings where I could see the mountains in the distance. Birds called out from the branches, and small animals rustled in the undergrowth. It was exactly what I needed: quiet, solitude. Nothing but the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt. About an hour in, I passed an old wooden sign, barely readable from years of wear. It pointed in two directions. One way led to a small lake, the other continued up toward the ridge. I followed my planned route, moving steadily upward. The air grew cooler as I gained elevation, and the wind picked up slightly. Nothing out of the ordinary. It was only after another hour that things started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just small things. The woods seemed quieter, like the usual sounds of birds and insects had faded away. The wind felt stronger, pushing through the trees in irregular bursts. Every now and then, I'd hear a sharp cracking noise, like a branch snapping far off in the distance. Probably just animals moving around. But something about it made me uneasy. I kept walking, shaking the feeling off. The sun was getting lower, and I wanted to reach my campsite before dark. The trail steepened, forcing me to push harder, my breath coming in slow, steady puffs. When I finally reached the ridge, the view was incredible. The valley stretched out below, a mix of deep green and patches of open rock. The sky was starting to shift to that soft orange of early evening. I set up camp near a small clearing, making sure my tent was secure before starting a small fire. As I ate my food, I tried to shake the lingering unease. It was just the isolation, I told myself. I wasn't used to being completely alone like this. That was all. Then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I saw it. Down the ridge, maybe 50 yards away, a shape was standing at the tree line. It was too far to make out details, but it wasn't an animal. It was human. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing in my direction. My stomach tightened. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. Was it the person from the other car? Why weren't they moving? Why weren't they making a sound? I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes on them. "Hey!" I called out. No response. No movement. I felt my pulse start to pick up. The fire crackled beside me, casting shifting shadows across the ground. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the figure. The beam cut through the dim light, landing right where they should have been. But there was nothing there. I swore under my breath. My eyes had to be playing tricks on me. It was getting dark, shadows were stretching, and my mind was probably overreacting. But the uneasy feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. I made the decision to keep the fire going a little longer before turning in for the night. The wind had died down, but the forest still felt unnaturally quiet. Every now and then, I'd glance toward the tree line, half expecting to see the figure again. I didn't sleep well. Every sound outside my tent made me tense up, my ears straining. A few times, I thought I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, but when I unzipped the tent and looked, there was nothing. Just the flickering glow of the dying fire and the dark outline of trees against the sky. At some point, exhaustion won. I drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a noise just outside my tent. A single, deliberate snap, like someone stepping on a branch. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. I didn't move. I just listened. Nothing. Just silence. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly unzipped the tent, peering out with my flashlight. The beam swept across the clearing, the trees, the empty ground, and then I saw them. Footprints, fresh in the dirt just outside my tent. Not mine, and leading away, back toward the tree line. I didn't waste time. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my hands shaking. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. I wasn't staying. With my flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other, I started down the trail, moving fast but careful. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen. Nothing, but the feeling never left. That sense of being watched, of something just beyond the edge of my vision. I didn't stop until I reached my car, lungs burning, legs aching. The lot was still empty, except for my vehicle and the other car. But something about that old sedan felt wrong. I hadn't noticed before, but now I did. The windows were dusty, the tires slightly deflated. It had been sitting there for a long time. I didn't look inside. I didn't want to know. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't stop until I was back in town, surrounded by streetlights and the hum of civilization. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never found out who or what was out there that night. I don't think I want to. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but work and life kept getting in the way. Today, I finally had the time. The trail was one I'd never done before, a winding path through dense woods that promised a view of the valley below. I packed my bag the night before: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a light jacket. I didn't think I'd need much else. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, and the sky was clear. I parked my car at the trailhead, locked it, and started walking. The first hour was easy. The trail was well marked, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves. The air smelled fresh, like pine and earth. I felt good, strong. My boots crunched on the gravel, and my breathing was steady. I passed a couple of other hikers early on, but after a while I was alone. That's what I wanted. Some time to myself, away from the noise of the city. The trail began to climb and the trees grew thicker. The sunlight filtered through the branches in patches, casting long shadows on the ground. I checked my watch. It was later than I thought. I had been walking for almost 2 hours, and the sun was dipping lower. I told myself I'd turn back soon, but I wanted to reach the overlook. The map said it wasn't far, just a little further. The forest changed as I went deeper. The trees seemed taller, their trunks thicker. The underbrush was denser and the trail narrowed. I had to step over roots and rocks, and my pace slowed. The air felt heavier, damp. I could hear the sound of running water somewhere nearby, but I couldn't see it. The birds had stopped singing. The only sound was the crunch of my boots and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I started to feel uneasy. I told myself it was just the quiet, the isolation. I'd been on hikes before, and I knew how the woods could play tricks on your mind. But this felt different. The shadows seemed darker, the trees closer together. I kept walking, telling myself I was being silly. The overlook had to be close. I could almost feel it. Then I saw it. A break in the trees, a clearing. I quickened my pace, relief flooding through me. But when I reached the clearing, it wasn't the overlook. It was just a small, empty space surrounded by trees. The ground was soft, covered in moss and fallen leaves. There was no view, no valley, just more trees. I checked my map again, but it didn't make sense. According to the trail markers, I should have been at the overlook by now. I looked around, trying to orient myself. The sun was almost gone, and the light was fading fast. I felt a pang of panic, but pushed it down. I wasn't lost. I just needed to retrace my steps. I turned around and started back the way I came. But the trail looked different now. The trees seemed closer together, the path less clear. I told myself it was just the fading light, but the unease in my chest grew. I walked faster, my boots pounding on the ground. The forest was silent except for the sound of my breathing and the rustle of leaves underfoot. Then I heard it, a sound behind me like footsteps. I stopped, my heart pounding. I turned around, but there was nothing there, just the trees, the shadows. I told myself it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but the sound came again, closer this time. I spun around, my flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing, just the trees. I started walking again, faster now. The sound followed me, keeping pace. My mind raced. It had to be an animal. But why would an animal follow me? I tried to stay calm, but my breath came in short, shallow gasps. The trail twisted and turned, and I couldn't remember if I'd passed this way before. The trees all looked the same, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The sound grew louder, closer. I broke into a run, my bag bouncing against my back. My flashlight beam bounced wildly, illuminating the trees in flashes. I could hear my own breathing, loud and ragged. The trail seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning, leading me deeper into the forest. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the trail. I skidded to a stop, my heart pounding. The figure was tall, dressed in dark clothes. I couldn't see their face. I raised my flashlight, but the beam didn't reach them. They just stood there, motionless. I didn't know what to do. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. The forest was silent, the air thick with tension. I took a step back, then another. The figure didn't follow. I turned and ran, my boots slamming against the ground. I didn't look back. I just ran. The trail seemed to stretch on forever. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I could still hear the footsteps behind me, keeping pace. I didn't know if it was the figure or something else. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to get out of the woods. Finally, I saw it. The trailhead. My car was there, just a few yards away. I sprinted the last few steps, fumbling with my keys. I unlocked the door, threw myself inside, and locked it again. My hands shook as I started the engine. I didn't look back. I just drove, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't until I was on the main road that I allowed myself to breathe. My hands were still shaking, and my clothes were soaked with sweat. I didn't know what had happened back there, but I didn't want to think about it. I just wanted to get home. When I got back, I locked the doors and turned on all the lights. I sat on the couch, my mind racing. I kept seeing the figure in my mind, standing there in the trail. Who were they? What did they want? I didn't have any answers. All I knew was that I wasn't going back to that trail. Not ever. The next day, I called the park ranger. I told them what had happened, but they didn't seem concerned. They said it was probably just another hiker, someone who got turned around like I did. But I knew that wasn't true. The figure hadn't been lost. They had been waiting. I didn't sleep well for weeks after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing in the trail. I started carrying pepper spray with me, even in the city. I didn't feel safe anymore. The woods had always been my escape, my place to think and breathe. but now they felt like a trap. I tried to put it out of my mind, but it was always there, lurking in the back of my thoughts. I started avoiding the news, afraid I'd see something about a missing hiker or a body found in the woods. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to forget, but I couldn't. The memory of that night stayed with me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I didn't talk about it with anyone. What would I say? That I got spooked in the woods and ran like a coward? No one would understand. So I kept it to myself, buried it deep. Months passed and life went on. I went back to work, back to my routine. But I never went hiking again, not even on the easy trails. The woods didn't feel safe anymore. They felt alive, watching, waiting. I didn't know what was out there, but I didn't want to find out. Sometimes late at night, I'd wake up in a cold sweat. The image of the figure burned into my mind. I'd tell myself it was just a dream, but I knew better. It was real, and it was out there somewhere in the dark. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. The woods were my sanctuary, but now they're my nightmare. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know it wasn't human. Not entirely. There was something wrong with it, something off, and it's still out there, waiting for the next hiker to come along. I don't go into the woods anymore. I don't even like driving past them. The memory of that night is too fresh, too real. I don't know if I'll ever be able to shake it, but I do know one thing. I'm never going back. Not ever. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but work kept getting in the way. Today, I finally had the time. The trail was one I had never taken before, but the map made it look straightforward. A loop that would take me through the woods and back to the parking lot before dark. I packed my bag with the essentials: water, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and some snacks. I didn't think I'd need much more than that. It was just a hike after all. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your nose and makes your breath visible. I zipped up my jacket and tightened the straps on my backpack. The trailhead was marked by a wooden sign, the paint faded and peeling. It pointed into the trees, the path barely visible under a layer of fallen leaves. I took a deep breath and started walking. The first mile was easy. The trail was wide, the ground firm under my boots. The trees were tall and thin, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting long shadows across the ground. I could hear birds chirping somewhere in the distance, but otherwise the woods were quiet. Too quiet. I shook off the feeling and kept walking. By the time I reached the second mile marker, the sun was almost gone. The shadows had grown longer, darker, and the air felt heavier. I pulled out my flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting through the gloom. The trail had narrowed, the trees pressing in on either side. The ground was softer here, the mud sucking at my boots with every step. I could hear the sound of running water somewhere nearby, but I couldn't see it. I checked the map again. The trail was supposed to follow the creek for a while before looping back. I thought I was on the right path, but the markers were few and far between. I kept walking, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the trees. The sound of the water grew louder, but I still couldn't see the creek. The trail seemed to be leading me away from it, deeper into the woods. I stopped and looked around. The trees all looked the same, their trunks dark and gnarled. The ground was covered in a thick layer of leaves, making it hard to see where the trail was. I took a few steps forward, then stopped again. Something felt off. The air was too still, the silence too heavy. I could feel my heart beating in my chest, the sound of it loud in my ears. I turned around, thinking I must have missed a marker, but the trail behind me looked just as unfamiliar as the one ahead. I pulled out my phone, hoping to check my location, but there was no signal. I cursed under my breath and shoved it back in my pocket. I had to keep moving. Standing still wasn't going to help. The trail began to slope downward, the ground becoming even softer. My boots sank into the mud with every step, the sound of it squelching in the quiet. The trees were thicker here, their branches tangled together overhead. The beam of my flashlight caught on something shiny, and I stopped. It was a piece of metal half buried in the mud. I bent down to get a closer look. It was a knife, the blade rusted and the handle cracked. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It felt heavy, cold. I didn't like the look of it, but I slipped it into my pocket anyway. Maybe it would come in handy. I kept walking, the trail twisting and turning through the trees. The sound of the water was gone now, replaced by a low, steady hum. It took me a moment to realize what it was. The wind. It was picking up, rustling the leaves and making the branches creak. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and kept moving. The trail began to climb again, the ground becoming rocky and uneven. My legs were starting to ache, and my breath came in short, sharp bursts. I stopped to take a drink of water, the cold liquid soothing my dry throat. I looked up at the sky, but the trees were too thick to see anything. The wind was louder now, howling through the branches. I could feel it pushing against me, trying to knock me off balance. I kept climbing, the trail growing steeper with every step. My flashlight flickered, the beam growing dim. I shook it, but it didn't help. The batteries were dying. I cursed again and picked up the pace. I needed to find the trailhead before the light was completely gone. The wind was howling now, the sound of it like a wild animal. The trees were swaying, their branches snapping and cracking. I could feel the cold seeping through my jacket, biting at my skin. My hands were numb, my fingers stiff. I shoved them into my pockets, my fingers brushing against the knife. I pulled it out, holding it tightly in my hand. It made me feel better, even though I didn't know why. The trail leveled out, the ground becoming firmer. I could see a break in the trees ahead, a patch of sky. I hurried toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. The wind was so loud now, it was hard to think. I broke through the trees and stopped, my breath catching in my throat. I was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground dropping away into darkness. The wind was stronger here, pushing against me, trying to pull me over the edge. I took a step back, my heart racing. The beam of my flashlight flickered again, then went out completely. I was plunged into darkness. I stood there for a moment, frozen. The wind was howling in my ears, the sound of it deafening. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, making it hard to move. I took a deep breath and forced myself to think. I couldn't stay here. I had to keep moving. I turned around, the darkness pressing in on me. I could barely see the trail, but I knew it was there. I started walking, my steps slow and careful. The wind was at my back now, pushing me forward. I kept one hand on the knife, the other outstretched in front of me, feeling for obstacles. The trail began to slope downward again, the ground becoming softer. I could feel the mud sucking at my boots, the sound of it squelching in the dark. The wind was quieter here, the trees blocking most of it. I kept walking, my steps steady. I could feel the tension in my chest easing, the fear slowly fading. I don't know how long I walked. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. The darkness was all-consuming, the silence heavy. I could hear my own breathing, the sound of it loud in my ears. My legs were aching, my feet sore. I wanted to stop, to rest, but I knew I couldn't. I had to keep moving. The trail began to widen, the trees thinning out. I could see a faint light ahead, a break in the darkness. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The light grew brighter, the trees falling away. I broke through the tree line and stopped, my breath catching in my throat. I was back at the trailhead. The parking lot was empty, the only light coming from a single street lamp. I could see my car, the metal glinting in the dim light. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. Couldn't believe I was back. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, the tension in my chest finally easing. I walked to my car, my steps slow and unsteady. I opened the door and climbed inside, the warmth of the interior a welcome relief. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I could still feel the cold in my bones, the fear in the back of my mind. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the knife. The blade rusted and the handle cracked. I stared at it for a moment, then tossed it onto the passenger seat. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The road was empty, the the trees lining either side. I could feel the tension in my chest easing, the fear slowly fading. I didn't know what had happened out there, but I was glad to be out of the woods. I drove home in silence, the sound of the engine a steady hum. The streets were quiet, the houses dark. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the car, the silence pressing in on me. I sat there for a moment, staring at the house. It looked the same as it always did, but it felt different. I didn't feel safe anymore. I got out of the car and walked to the front door, my steps slow and careful. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the warmth of the house a welcome relief. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I could still feel the cold in my bones, the fear in the back of my mind. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, the liquid soothing my dry throat. I sat down at the table and stared at the glass, my hands shaking. I didn't know what had happened out there, but I knew I wouldn't forget it. The woods had changed me, and I didn't know if I would ever feel safe again. I finished the water and stood up, my legs still shaky. I walked to the living room and sat down on the couch, the cushions soft under me. I could feel the exhaustion creeping in, my body heavy. I leaned back and closed my eyes, the darkness pressing in on me. I didn't want to sleep, but I knew I had to. I woke up the next morning, the sunlight streaming through the windows. I sat up, my body stiff and sore. I could still feel the cold in my bones, the fear in the back of my mind. I got up and walked to the kitchen, the floor cold under my feet. I parked my truck at the trailhead just before sunrise. The gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped out, adjusting the straps on my pack. The air was crisp, carrying that damp, earthy scent you only get in deep woods after a cold night. I pulled my map from my pocket, running my finger along the marked path. It was a loop, about 15 miles through dense forest and up to a ridge with a good view of the valley. I had hiked plenty of trails like this before. This one was a bit more remote than most, but that was the appeal. No crowds, no noise, just the sounds of the woods and my own footsteps. I locked my truck, shouldered my pack, and started walking. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well marked, the trees towering overhead, sunlight filtering through in shifting patches. Birds called from the branches, and every so often, I heard the rustle of something small in the underbrush, probably squirrels or chipmunks. Felt good to be out here, away from everything. A few miles in, the trail started climbing. The trees grew thicker, the canopy blocking out most of the morning light. The temperature dropped slightly, and the silence became more noticeable. There were fewer birds now, no wind shaking the leaves, just the steady sound of my boots on the dirt. About 6 miles in, I reached a small clearing with a stream running through it. I knelt, splashing cold water on my face before refilling my bottle. The sound of the water was nice, steady, grounding. I sat on a fallen log, unzipping my pack to grab a protein bar. That's when I noticed something odd. The woods were completely silent. I don't mean the usual quiet of being alone in the wilderness. I mean absolute silence. No birds, no insects, no rustling leaves. Just the faint hum of my own breath and heartbeat in my ears. It was unnatural. I stayed still for a moment, listening. Nothing. I shook it off. Maybe a predator was nearby. A mountain lion, maybe. That would explain the silence. Animals go quiet when they sense danger. I stood up, slung my pack back over my shoulders, and continued on. The trail climbed steeper now. The trees grew even closer together, branches twisting overhead, blocking out most of the daylight. The farther I went, the heavier the air felt, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. My boots scuffed against the dirt and rocks, the only sound in the otherwise dead quiet forest. Around the 8-mile mark, I started noticing things that felt off. The trees didn't look right. Some were stripped of bark in long, jagged patches. The exposed wood beneath scratched deep, like something had clawed at them. I stopped at one, running my fingers over the grooves. They were deep, too deep for a bear. I pushed on, but the unease had settled in my gut now. My pace picked up. I wasn't panicking, not yet, but I felt the need to keep moving. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting what? I didn't know, but something felt wrong. At mile 10, I reached the ridge. The trees thinned out, revealing a wide view of the valley below. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the anxiety. The sun had started dipping lower, stretching long shadows across the forest floor. I sat on a flat rock, forcing myself to eat another protein bar, drink some water, breathe. Then I saw it. Down in the valley, near the tree line, something moved. Too far to make out details, but it was big. Not a deer, not a bear. It moved too strangely for that. I squinted, trying to track it, but it disappeared into the trees before I could get a clear look. That was enough for me. I decided to cut my break short and keep moving. The rest of the loop would take me back down through the forest, but I didn't want to be out here after dark. I checked my map again. If I kept a steady pace, I could make it back to my truck before nightfall. I started descending, forcing myself not to rush. I didn't want to trip and twist an ankle out here. The silence followed me, pressed against my ears, heavy, unnatural. Every now and then, I'd hear a faint sound behind me. Something moving, but always just out of sight. I refused to look back. At mile 12, the trail split. I knew from the map that both paths led back to the trailhead, but one was shorter, less than 3 miles to go. I didn't hesitate. I took the shorter path. The farther I went, the more the woods changed. The trees leaned in at strange angles. The ground felt softer, almost spongy beneath my boots. A rotten smell filled the air, damp and sour, like something long dead. My pulse hammered in my ears. Then I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. The dirt was disturbed, pressed down by something large, but the shape wasn't right. Not a boot, not an animal print, just deep impressions, uneven, almost dragging, leading in the same direction I was going. I stopped. My breath came quick and shallow. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, but I knew I couldn't. I was too far in, so I kept walking. The smell grew stronger. My skin crawled. My muscles ached with the effort of keeping my pace steady. I didn't run. Running would make noise. Running would make me look like prey. Then, up ahead, I saw something on the trail. A shape, small, still. As I got closer, my stomach turned. A rabbit, or what was left of it. Torn open, its inside strewn across the path. Fresh. I swallowed hard and stepped around it. The last mile felt like the longest of my life. Every step, I expected to hear something behind me. Every shadow looked like it was moving. My vision tunneled, my heartbeat pounding in my skull. Then, finally, I saw it, the break in the trees, the trailhead, my truck. I ran. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. My boots pounded against the dirt. I hit the gravel, fumbling with my keys, throwing myself into the driver's seat. The door slammed shut. I locked it. My hands shook as I started the engine. I didn't look back as I peeled out onto the road. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't know what was following me. I don't want to know. I just know I won't be hiking that trail again.